Namaskar. Welcome everybody to Cārvāka podcast. So today's podcast is a podcast which is going to be called The Art of Conversation. So let me explain to you why I decided to host Amit. So Amit was gracious enough to call me on his podcast, and we had a 5.5 hour long conversation on his podcast. जहाँ पे अमित है was basically like, देखो इसके परिवार के बारे में किसी को मालूम नहीं है, तो सबको इसके परिवार के बारे में भी पता लगा देते. एंड वी हैड अ ग्रेट कॉन्वर्सेशन. एंड बेचारे अमित को बहुत सारी गालियां मिली. फिर मैंने बोला ऐसे नहीं होता ना, अच्छी तरह से अगर अमित वर्मा को गालियां खानी है तो फिर अमित वर्मा को मेरी ही पॉडकास्ट पे मैं बुला लेता हूँ. एंड देन अमित वर्मा वाज लाइक, हाँ यार अच्छे से गाली खानी है, पूरे से खानी है. सो अमित ब्रदर, वेलकम एंड थैंक्स फॉर कमिंग.
Thank you. I didn't know this was your intention कि मुझे और गालियाँ आपको खिलवानी है, but I'm glad to be here. The galiyas come and go, but also my episode with you, various people wrote in and they said, thank you for getting Kushal. It was so refreshing to listen to that point of view, and we went and checked out his Cārvāka podcast and we listened to that now. So I think you'll. I always say that the internet is full of these vocal minorities who are always shouting, but the silent majority is by and large sensible. And theek hai, the vocal minority shouted as you would expect, but and without even listening to it, because like our whole sort of ethic is ki there should always be dialogue, that there should always be reasonable dialogue in good faith. That is why we got together. We are of the same mind. We did that episode, and right at the start of the episode I said that, listen, Kushal is pro BJP, pro Hindutva, I am the opposite, so let us have a good discussion. Introduction mein bola, people don't even get that far. People are like, why are you platforming kushalmehra and all of this, and you have also become a Sanghi. Like, first of all, I don't think you are really a Sanghi, and secondly, I've also had Tisra Setalwad and Akar Patel and recently the Alt News guys on my show. That counts for nothing. I get one Kushalmehra and I'm suddenly, I've done something terrible. This word platformed is also like just complete nuts. Just listen to the freaking show is, what I would say. And everyone who listened has by and large reacted really positively, in the sense that I think at some level unke man mein bhi wo caricature tha ki Kushal is like this, right-wing ecosystem is like this. So I think it's good that people actually get a chance to listen to people and understand them, and before jumping at a judgment.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with you. One of the biggest reasons I wanted to have a conversation with you on my platform was that when we spent, from me coming to your house, recording and leaving, I was there at your house for like 8 hours that day, almost approximately 8 hours, give or take. In that, the conclusion I drew was I agree with Amit Varma on almost most key issues, other than a few bits and bobs over here, there. I was like, why am I in this imaginary war with people? Like, why is this imaginary war? Why do we argue so much? And why are we attached to ideas and art? And which is why I wanted to call this the art of conversation, because I think we are losing it. And to me, that's the scariest part, because I know you are very kind. You are far more kind than me when it comes to appreciating other people. I'm actually very critical of the overall Indian podcasting space. And I want to give you credit that actually you're much more large-hearted than I am in that sense. I'm extremely critical at times of the Indian podcasting space, but you were one of the people who I used to actually consider a serious podcaster, even before, we got to know each other. And you can ask many people, including someone, we have common friends and common people that both of us know. And I would always tell them, नहीं, मैं अमित की इज्जत करता हूँ. अमित सीरियस पॉडकास्टर है. अमित एक्चुअल में पॉडकास्टिंग करता है. जो पॉडकास्टिंग का अर्थ, मतलब जो what podcasting is supposed to be. Podcast is supposed to be a process. So let's start there. When you decided, how did you come up with the idea कि भाई अभी podcast करनी है? What was that reason?
Yeah. I've learned a lot in that journey, so let me take you through it. But I'll also, inform everyone who's watching this. I have this YouTube show called Everything is Everything. So I used to teach a podcasting course once upon a time. साल में 2 बार करता था. Then one day I decided कि और नहीं सिखाना. Like I have a writing course which still runs, लेकिन I don't want to teach the podcasting course anymore. So I put all my knowledge into one episode of Everything is Everything, which is episode 49, is called The Art of Podcasting. So it's basically my course in an episode which is about 1.5 hours long, and it takes one through the journey. But let me take you through some of the elements of the journey which really opened my eyes. हुआ क्या था कि 8 साल पहले I was chilling out doing other stuff where these guys called IVM Podcasts came to me and said, look, let's team up, let's do a podcast, let's experiment. The guy who ran IVM, Amit Doshi, he said कि he'd followed me from my blogging days in the aughties. He said कि एक podcast करते हैं. तो मैंने कहा ठीक है. I came up with an idea which was basically the seen and the unseen, and the idea was it's about the unintended consequences of public policy, because most public policy ideas that are intuitive are often wrong. Like price controls, for example. People go in there with the good intention that it'll make things affordable, but they always lead to scarcities. Most policies meant to help the poor harm the poor, etc., etc. So I said कि ठीक है, let me do a show on policies. Episodes will be 10 minutes, 15 minutes, etc., etc. And and I, in those days, because I wasn't a power listener of podcasts, my impression was that people have a short attention span. You got to get them in the first 15 seconds, and then you got to hook them quickly. You got to keep them there. You got to keep it short. I realized that is wrong for 3 reasons. Reason number one is people typically listen to podcasts, as in I'm talking about audio podcasts on their smartphones. People typically listen to podcasts in one of 3 use cases, which is when you're commuting, you're working out, or you're doing errands like washing dishes, etc., etc. So what happens is that you are in those moments a captive audience. अगर आप YouTube देख रहे हैं, तो any moment you can just click and click on one of the 500 tabs you have open. You can turn your head and talk to someone. You can pick up a book on the table. But if you're out jogging, you're not going to constantly be shifting. You've decided to listen to something. You're relatively captive. Reason number two is the speed that people listen to. Our brain can comprehend 500 words a minute. My speaking speed, which is kind of normal, is about 160 words a minute. So there is a spare capacity. This is also why sometimes we get distracted so easily, because we figured out what the other person is saying, and the brain gets to work. So and people think कि अरे fast speed में सुनना है तो बहुत squeaky हो जाएगा. That's what I used to think, and you'll miss nuance and you'll miss gaps and all of that. But the point is, you should, like, the advice I give is take it to 1.2, that will normalize, and take it to 1.5, and so on till you reach your natural level. I can listen to some things at up to 3.5, and the thing is that you don't actually miss anything. The brain normalizes, so you're getting the gaps in the conversation, you're getting the silences, you're getting the nuances, you're getting everything. So power listeners are listening at a higher speed, and therefore if you have a 20-minute podcast, you're basically listening to it in 10 minutes. By the time you've tied your shoelaces to go jogging, it's over, right? And the third reason is that people crave depth. The rest of the media thinks is catering to the short attention span. So it is basically a mile wide and an inch deep. And therefore, we are always, in this shallow rhythm where we are swiping, scrolling. And all of us, there will be times swiping and scrolling more than we like. But there are also times you want to get deep, you want to get into a rabbit hole, you want to understand what someone is really saying. So there is a tremendous hunger for depth out there. And as I realized this over time, my lens increased. First, what happened is, instead of talking about just one topic, I started doing deep dives into subjects, and those became like 2 hours, 3 hours. When 370 was repealed, I had an episode on that with Srinath Raghavan, which was 3 hours, that went viral, etc., etc. And from there, my deep dives into subjects would often go to 3 hours, 4 hours. I started doing deep dives into people, which could often last 5, 6, 7, 8 hours. 5 hours is kind of standard. So the episode you and I did is kind of standard and not super long in that sense. और इसमें क्या होता है ना, I fell in love with this format, and I'll tell you why. Like आपने पहले jokingly कहा कि अरे मेरे family के बारे में पूछा, he thought people are interested. I'll tell you, that's a real deal. The part of the conversation that I had with you that I truly cherish and will always cherish is where I got to know you, where you speak about your childhood, your insecurities, the things that you did, the shaping of you, your family. For me, it's super important to understand you, to understand where you came from. Often what happens is ki, yeah, if I want to listen to person X on expert X on subject Y, मैं YouTube पे जाके search डाल दूंगा, there'll be हजार panel discussions and small podcasts and all that. But if you want to really understand a person and get to know someone, that is gold, and you have to dig a little deeper. Like I've done 6 episodes with Ram Guha, someone I like and admire a big deal. And now he's been caricatured by both the right and the left, right? And you want to go past those caricatures, and you want to build something where you get to understand the person, you get a sense ki bhai ye kaun hai, what makes him tick, etc., etc., and you want to build that connection. And what then happens is that everyone who's watching, once they get to know the person, they get a sense of that, they become much more open to his ideas. The caricatures dissolve away. Like I remember the fifth and the sixth episodes I've done with him were completely personal. There's no talk of any book or anything like that. It's just completely personal. In one of them, he gave me this beautiful anecdote about how he likes to listen to classical music. So sometimes he'll go into his bedroom and he'll lie on the bed and he'll just get carried away while he's listening. And often his wife has come home from work at night and she'll open the bedroom door and Ram is just lying there in the dark listening to music, completely lost in the music, right? And then when he shares that music, and it is in my show notes because my show notes are like really exhaustive, I try to capture everything. Then imagine you listen to that and you go to the show notes and you listen to the same music that Ram loves and you feel something, and in that moment you are connected as human beings. You're connected with him, you're connected with everyone who's ever been moved by that music. So those connections are truly important. What I also feel is that the quality of the conversation is beautiful. Often what will happen is ki you are an expert in one subject, you've got all your prepared sound bites in your head. In a sense, you are what chat gpt is often accused of being, your autocomplete on steroids, right? We are all actually far more autocomplete than people realize. Most of the time we are speaking in cliches and everything is kind of automatic. But when you ask someone to talk about their childhood, like people on my show have spoken about things I've never spoken about before. When you ask them to talk about their moms, to talk about their dads, to go into those early areas. One of my guests, for the first time ever, spoke to someone about how he had tried to kill himself when he was in the 10th standard, and his wife got mad at him later because she said, we've been married for 40 years, I never knew that. And when you go into that kind of territory where the guests trust you because they know that you're speaking in good faith, you're also making yourself vulnerable, and you've been through a conversation with me, you know exactly that mutual trust is almost immediate. And then you will say anything, and it becomes that sort of safe space. And I think listeners by and large respect this, that no matter what people say on this podcast, maybe it attracts a kind of listener, because obviously it's so long and all that, it attracts a kind of committed listener कि वो outrage वाले नहीं आते. Like होता क्या है कि when I think of the outrage on social media, I think the act of passing judgment is something that we should be skeptical of. Like, what are you really doing when you're passing judgment on someone? You are proclaiming your own virtue and your own knowledge. You're effectively saying, I'm more virtuous than that guy, I'm more knowledgeable than that guy, therefore I will shit on him. It is such a toxic act. And those kinds of people do not really listen to the show. So I've had, many things said which the right would be aggrieved by, many things said which the left would be aggrieved by. But on my show, the kind of listener who comes, they don't really care, because it is, in a sense, if that makes any sense, a kind of audio safe space. Like, my favorite compliment I've ever got for the show is I'd done a long episode with Abhinandan Sekhri, the life and times of Abhinandan Sekhri, and someone wrote to me and said that while they were listening to that show, it felt so much that they're sitting in a drawing room listening to two friends talking, that at one point that person interrupted, and then they had remembered that, fuck it, I'm not here, it's a podcast. And I love that, and that's a kind of intimacy which I want to bring about. So when you and I had our conversation, I have no doubt that many people listening to that conversation would have felt ki yaar ye to apne jaisa hai, yaar ye to dost hai, or I understand. And then you may disagree on some margins, but like I said, the disagreement is on the margins. Fundamentally, people are people, they are talking, you're getting to know them. So that's sort of my broad story, and some of what I've learned in this journey.
So on the topic of disagreement, now what I call it degrees of disagreement, right? And issues of disagreement. This is where I come from, and I want to know your views on how do you handle that. Now, let's say why degrees of disagreement is, I take this inspiration from Daniel Dennett, the a great compatibilist materialist philosopher who recently passed away a few weeks ago. And Dan Dennett, on the question of free will, used to say why he is a compatibilist, and he used to talk about degrees of freedom. I'm using that analogy and explaining the degrees of disagreement we can have. Now, somebody might like a Virat Kohli, somebody might like a Steve Smith, to use a cricketing analogy. That is a degree of disagreement that I don't know, for some odd reason, one can handle. But then there are certain areas where, let's say, you know, somebody might think an underage marriage is fine, and somebody might think an underage marriage is not fine. Now that's when the disagreement, it's still a disagreement. It's like, okay, you like Virat Kohli, I like Steve Smith. You like underage marriage, I don't like underage marriage. Or somebody might think the death penalty is fine, somebody might think the death penalty is not fine. Or or in my case, the people like me who say the death penalty has to be the rarest of rare cases. For example, in my view, the classic case, Nirbhaya RG Kar, there is no moral argument that I find that the perpetrators don't deserve the death penalty. I just don't see a moral argument behind it. Now, how do we understand disagreement? Like, where do you come from? Like, people say, the stupidest disclaimer, Amit, that I've read is, I don't agree on everything with, and I've also used that stupid disclaimer many times in the past before somebody thinks I'm above others. No, I'm also in that stupid person race. I was like, जैसे कि मैं मेरी बीवी से हर चीज में एग्री करता हूँ, जैसे कि मेरी बीवी मेरे से हर चीज में एग्री करती है. I don't agree with my parents on everything. I don't agree with my brother on everything. How do we understand disagreement? Like, are there certain disagreements that are so morally repulsive that that's when we create the problem? Like, how do we handle that?
That's a beautiful, deep question. I haven't thought about it, and no doubt, I'll process it over time. But let me think aloud for the moment. Let me first talk about, over time, how my way of viewing the world can alter itself and will not alter itself. Like, what am I dogmatic about? What am I not dogmatic about? What I am not dogmatic about are the facts, right? So I am always, the world is deeply complex. We understand only a small sliver of it. So I might have a certain view of the world, a factual view of the world. And if you convince me that I'm wrong on some margin, I'm willing to modify that completely. As far as the complexity of the world is concerned, I have that humility. Where I am dogmatic is on the values that I have arrived at over a period of time. So those values are all, the classical liberal values are based around individual freedom, the value of individual freedom and consent and autonomy and agency and all of those. And that is an area where that's an area where I feel pretty strongly about. So now, as far as right, liking Virat Kohli or Steve Smith is concerned, that's an aesthetic disagreement. It is as trivial as you saying blue is great and I say green is good, and we'd both have to be morons to kind of attack each other for it. Though on Twitter, obviously, the blue people will say the green people are evil and vice versa. So, but that's a very trivial issue. On deeper issues, it really depends on where the margin of disagreement is. Like, as far as the death penalty is concerned, I sort of agree that in the rarest of the rare cases, you should have the death penalty. However, I'm against the death penalty for the practical reason that the state is deeply inept and incompetent and will often fuck up. And therefore, there is a chance that the wrong people will suffer, and you don't want that to happen at all. So my main argument against the death penalty is the ineptness of the state. I'm all for life imprisonment for people who commit these kind of heinous crimes, but given the ineptness of the state, especially in India, and the nature of the legal system, I am not comfortable with giving it too much power. Like, one of the things that we've normalized is the monopoly on violence that we have given the state. Now, it is essential because that's what I call the great liberal paradox, that we need the state to protect our rights, but for the state to exist, it has to infringe on some of our rights, because the existence of the state comes because of tax money. Taxes are always coercive, and therefore, just at a moral level, every I'd once written a piece for Times of India with this headline: every act of government is an act of violence, right? And my sort of core principle is that let us recognize that there is a liberal paradox. We do need a state, and therefore I think the argument, like the different ideologies, what do they all argue about? I think what the core argument is, where is this violence justified? Where one particular way of looking at the world will say we should only have a night watchman state, it protects our rights. Another ones will say that no, the state should build infrastructure, positive externalities, etc., etc. Somebody else will say statues are important, temples are important. Somebody else will say full welfare society honi chahiye, etc., etc. Without taking a position on any of those, I think it's important to acknowledge that at the heart of it lies violence, and therefore whenever you talk about state action, you have to kind of take that violence into account and not normalize it and not imagine that there is no cost to state action. Anyway, this turned out to be a digression. But an example I would come to of, where you cross the line from something trivial into something that is based on values is, say, demonetization. Demonetization, and I wrote a viral piece in TOI around that time on it. Demonetization was the largest assault on property rights in human history, right? It was something that was completely out of Mao's playbook. I compared it with Mao's Great Leap Forward and everything that happened there. In that sense, it wasn't right-wing at all, because no Burkean conservative or Hayekian libertarian would ever approve of an assault like this. And people who justified it on the basis of, let's do a cost-benefit analysis. Like, first of all, there were no benefits, but a cost-benefit analysis by itself is a wrong frame of thinking about it, because a cost is on one group of people and the benefit is to another group of people. And there's something fundamentally immoral simply about thinking like that. And for me, that's a litmus test for a lot of economists where they fall on that. I'd written an editorial for a magazine I used to edit called Pragati, where I'd said that any economist who supports demonetization is either a bad economist or a bad human being, and often both. Now, that is a place where I'll draw the line, because there is a significant moral cost to something that you are supporting. Places where I simply cannot draw a line is, for example, pro-choice and pro-life, right? Like, I am pro-choice. Because obviously where I'm coming from, every woman owns her own body and she's got a right to decide what to do with it, and no one should be able to control that, etc., etc. I am pro-choice. But the pro-life argument about the value of life is something that I may not agree with, but I understand it, I sympathize with. I will never think that a pro-life person is evil, and I cannot speak to that person. It's just one of those complicated issues where you realize that, like, this is really difficult. The world does not give you easy answers. Like, I often tell people that the world is so complicated, any question you ask about it, the correct answer is it depends. That's how complicated it is. There are some matters in which you can look at it with a black and white lens, like, was Hitler evil? Of course, right, etc., etc. But other matters where you can't, and it's really complicated. But there are some areas where I draw a hard line in terms of values. So, for example, if anyone were to say, take an anti-Muslim line and say India should be a Hindu nation, and etc., etc., I just have a strong principled objection to that. And that is a disagreement which perhaps means that we can't be friends, and etc., etc., because that is just beyond the pale for me. um, uh, and equally, I can give you examples of beyond the pale on the left. Like, if someone who supports communism, like, either you're ignorant or you're just evil, because you look at the results of communism in the 20th century, you understand what it actually means, which is state control over everyone's life. It is profoundly anti-freedom. So then again, there is simply no point engaging. So, those are the levels at which disagreements break down. You and I can have a civil conversation, because by and large, I think on all core values, we are not very far away from each other, as you said at the start of the show. And then we might, like, if you think of what our differences will always come down to the facts which we consider about the world, where you will make an argument that, hey, the BJP is the best of the options, and I will make an argument that no, the anti-Muslim nature of it is such that in its current avatar, I can't support it. I thought our finest prime ministers, in my view, are PV Narasimha Rao and Atal Bihari Vajpayee. So that kind of tells you where I'm coming from. So it's not about the party per se. In another avatar, maybe I would not have an objection to the party, but the way it looks like currently, and given the fractures in our society, I think it's a problem. But it's entirely fair if you say that, hey, the world is complex. Like Joan Robinson said, everything you say of India, the opposite is also true. And you point to the opposite side of the picture, and we can have a reasonable debate on that. But yeah, so that's broadly where I come down on that. A disagreement, if it is about, if it is in the margins, or if it is about aesthetic issues like Kohli versus Smith, then it doesn't really matter. It's stupid to fight about it. But if it comes at my core values, then I will just walk away. I won't even engage.
Yeah, although I have to agree with you. Damn, the Rohit Sharma fans versus the Kohli fans. Those fights on Twitter are some of the most magnificent fights I've seen in my life.
Yeah, people often say about, like, I love this quote about academic politics, that academic politics is so vicious because the stakes are so low. So I think a bunch of Twitter fights like Rohit Sharma versus Virat Kohli fans fighting with each other when the two guys are friends and they're chilling out is
Yeah,
just so bizarre.
yeah. I mean, it's insane. People. One friend of mine. I don't follow football a lot. I mean, Americans call it soccer, but one day somebody told me, "You think political Twitter is better? You have to go on soccer Twitter." And I was like, "Nahi yaar, kya baat kar raha hai? Ho hi nahi sakta." Because cricket Twitter is not that bitter. Honestly, the cricket fandom is not that bitter. And then I saw football Twitter, and I was like, "Amma Meri, ye log to pagal hai." They're so nasty to each other, and the vilest things are said on football Twitter. And I was like, I don't follow that sport. I'm just happy.
See, there's a fundamental human truth to this, which is that we are hardwired for tribalism. And, which football club you support is, in a sense, an expression of a kind of tribalism. And hardwired for doesn't exculpate it. Like, I think the beautiful thing about our species is that we are the one species that can, fight its own programming. And of course, we are hardwired in contradictory ways as well. And therefore, I think, especially over the last 300, 400 years, there's been a lot of progress in fighting this particular aspect of our programming, the tribal aspect of our programming. But if you see, pretty much every fight on Twitter or social media is around tribalism. The Rohit Sharma versus Virat Kohli, the Man United versus Man City, the BJP versus Congress. It's all around tribalism. And the moment you take a nuanced view, you are immediately shat upon by all tribes, because, like, what the fuck even.
Yeah, and it is true. People fail to realize, like, I 100% agree with you that, this short experiment that we are having through the Westminster style or offshoots of the Westminster style is not a long historical process. Our brains are still pre-agricultural. They're not even post-agricultural. Our brains take time to evolve. So if I go by the assumption that, the current Homo sapien evidence is give or take 300 to 350,000 years, and our brains were pretty much the hunter-gatherer one, where tribalism is the need of the hour. How do you survive otherwise? I mean, if you're not
And
tribal.
it's not just tribalism. Like, for Everything is Everything, we've done an episode on economic fallacies. And if you look at the common economic fallacies, most of them are because of the ways our brains are hardwired. Now, our programming essentially took shape in prehistoric times, where we were living in small tribes and etc., etc. So just to give you an example, there is a zero sum fallacy, right? Where in those times, it was natural to think everything is zero sum. If you've hunted down a deer, if you have a certain amount of that deer for your food, your tribes people will not get that much. It is very much zero sum. One person's win is another person's loss. Life was nasty, brutish, and short, and that's kind of what it was. But this is a tremendous fallacy when you think about the world today. And this is, for example, at the heart of the confusion which many people make between inequality and poverty, right? I'm so sick of people in India using the term inequality as a synonym for poverty. Actually, they almost mean opposite things and demand opposite solutions. You know, people who think they are the same are committing the zero sum fallacy, where they assume that for the rich to get richer, the poor must be getting poorer. The fact that they can both get rich at the same time, but the rich get richer at a faster rate, is incomprehensible to them. But the truth is, like, I love this phrase by John Stossel, the double thank you moment, which demonstrates a positive sumness of things. And the idea is that I go to a Starbucks, I pay X amount for a coffee, and the coffee is given to me. And when I pay, the cashier says thank you. And when I get the coffee, I say thank you. It's a double thank you moment. Why? Because we both benefited. I valued the coffee more than the money I paid for it. They valued the money more than the coffee they gave me. It's a double thank you moment. All human progress comes from double thank you moments like this. It is a positive sum game. And to go back to inequality versus poverty, the truth is that India's greatest problem is poverty. There's nothing else I care about. It is the whole deal. Our moral imperative is to get rid of poverty. But when you are a country in India's stage of development, poverty and inequality will go in opposite directions. What has happened since the 1991 liberalization is that we've got hundreds of millions of people out of poverty while inequality went up. Like, one question I often ask people is, where out of these two countries, where would you rather be a poor person, Bangladesh or the US? And obviously people would rather be poor in the US, but inequality in the US is much higher than in Bangladesh. So the reason people make this mistake is they commit the zero sum fallacy, and therefore they assume that the only way to do something about poverty is to redistribute wealth, that you then have to take from the rich and give to the poor. And this is an intuitive way of thinking. Another intuitive way of thinking, which is hardwired into us from prehistoric times, is top down thinking. Ki agar kuch karna hai, there has to be a planner who gets together and who does something, because at that small scale, that is pretty much how it is working. One head of the tribe is running the tribe, and everything is like a project which people can plan. But the world doesn't work like that. At the moment the scale gets too large, whether you're talking about evolution, whether you're talking about the evolution of language, whether you're talking about natural selection, or you talk about the way the economy works, it is spontaneous order where there is no central planner. To use Adam Ferguson's words, everything is then a result of human action but not human design. But we still commit the fatal conceit that we can control this from the top down, which was a fundamental mistake Nehru made, and which is a fundamental quality that Modi ji has taken from him. In that sense they are quite allied, that top down thinking, engineering mindset, ऊपर से PMO में decide करेंगे क्या करना है. But the world is deeply complex. It doesn't work like that. And that funda, that order can come from in a bottom up way rather than from the top down. That's deeply counterintuitive. So these are just two examples of positive sumness of things and spontaneous order, which are difficult for us to understand and grok, simply because our brains are wired in these olden times. And therefore this is a battle that every generation you just keep fighting, and and they're so fundamental to progress, and it's so frustrating that so many people don't get it, and the discourse is so filled with rubbish.
See, I've always noticed this, even when I was having a conversation with you, right? That and over the years of having conversations with a lot of people, everybody has an intellectual anchor. This is my observation, where their worldview is based around a subject they're very comfortable with. So in my case, like I had told you on our conversation on your podcast, is my worldview, everything stems from ethics and moral philosophy. Everything. It's like my entire thinking, even when my framing my questions, everything is stemming from that prism. Is it safe to say that in your case it stems from economics?
Yes and no, in the sense economics is very broad. It is a study of human behavior. It's not just about finance and numbers and whatever. It's a study of human behavior. What are the incentives created for us by scarcity, and how do we deal with that? So in that sense, economics is broad enough to take that in. But let me refer to this beautiful book I read a few years ago, which really influenced the way I just think about the subject of ideology. And this is a book by Arnold Kling called The Three Languages of Politics. And recently I went to DC, so he invited me to his home, and we recorded an episode in his basement as well. So great pleasure for me. But here's his fundamental thesis in The Three Languages of Politics. First, he makes a point that both you and I have seen, that most discourse in the public square is not people talking to each other, is people talking past each other or shouting at each other, right? And why is that? And what he says is that, and he's talking about this in the American context, where he's saying that there are three broad ideological tribes, and they all have different first principles that everything devolves from. So the conservatives will look at tradition, the progressives will look at equality, the libertarians will look at freedom, right? And what then happens is that when they talk to each other, they are keeping only their first principles in mind and not the other tribe that they are talking to. And therefore, they will inevitably talk past each other, and therefore, they will inevitably think that the other person is evil, and they will appear evil to the other person. So the way to have a discourse is that you take their priors into account. So for example, for me, freedom is a core value, but the reason it is a core value is not randomly that it plopped into my head one day, but because I can look at the world around me and I can see that, boss, freedom works. Economic freedom is the only way to prosperity, and cultural freedom is the only way to a flourishing culture, and etc., etc. So I can make arguments for freedom from both a deontological standpoint and a utilitarian standpoint. So, if I am talking to someone who really cares about equality, for example, I speak to someone who feels that, oh, there are so many people who are so poor. What do we do about the poverty? We should redistribute. The wrong way to approach that will be to just insist on freedom and be dogmatic about it. The right way will be to say that, yeah, it is a scandal. It is terrible that they are poor. Now, let's think about how do we get them out of poverty, and then it is up to me to make the empirical case that freedom is the best way out of that poverty, and it is essentially the only way that works. I've done an episode with Land Pritchett where we talk about this for a while. He's got great studies of development. He's a great developmental economist, and he's done these studies where he's looked at a whole cross section of countries, and he's looked at what we would consider human welfare indicators. So not just wealth, but human welfare indicators, like what's your health like, and the amount of freedom women have. And he's looked at all of them, and he's found that everywhere, without doubt, without exception, they are correlated to median per capita GDP, which essentially means economic growth, which only comes from economic freedom. And that's 99% of the causal effect. Other things like welfare redistribution are, in a 1%, they make really very little difference. So if you really care about poverty, the only way out is economic growth. Everything else, you're just playing a game that, hey, let's make the state work better, let's redistribute, etc., etc. They do not move the needle at all. Those studies are out there, but anyway, that's a digression. But to come back to your sort of question, then the way to have that dialogue is to understand that their first principles are something else, whether it is tradition or equality, and to respect that and to talk about it from that point of view, that I understand what you're trying to do, and let me keep that in mind while I argue with you. And in many ways, I think of myself as someone who is liberal in their ends and conservative in their means. Like, and by liberal, I mean classical liberal, the freedom sort of outlook. Like when I look at my great heroes in the Indian freedom struggle, I look at people like Gopal Ganesh Agarkar, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Rana De, Nauroji, all those guys, late 19th century, early 20th century, and they were all liberal in their ends but conservative in their means, where they weren't trying to break everything down, but they were saying that, okay, we want more freedom, we want more autonomy, let's take it a step at a time, let's get there. You try to break everything down, you get something like the French Revolution, and that doesn't work at all. So I have respect for conservatives in terms of the means that we take towards progress, but my ends are essentially all about human freedom, agency, consent, so on and so forth. So that's broadly where I come from, and that shapes me. But that shapes me after I flirted with everything else. Like when I was in college, when I was 18 or 19, I'd walk around with Das Kapital in my uh, rucksack, and so I have done all the flirtations with left-wing thinking. I have they often say that if you're not a socialist at 18, you don't have a heart. If you're still a socialist at 25, you don't have a brain. And that's pretty much, I think, the sort of journey I made, that you have the journey that you're a bleeding heart, and then you take a further journey where intellectually you realize that if you really want to help those that your heart bleeds for, freedom is kind of the way out. So freedom, agency, consent, those are kind of my North Star. But when I am, in dialogue with someone, I want to first understand them and understand what their priors are and talk respectfully rather than just say, "Are ye to evil hai," So that's kind of what I aim to do.
How many people have you come across in your life who can steel man your argument?
Um, that's a great question, and I always try to steelman the arguments of
I've
anyone I
rarely
try
come
to
across.
argue with. But
Before you feel कि
yeah,
भाई मुझे अकेला पूछ रहा है साला खुद बता. Rarely. Most of the guests that come on my podcast cannot steal man.
yeah, it's a good question. I think if people are open, they'll make a good faith effort and they'll do it. Like when I give talks in colleges or whatever, which I have in the past, the younger people who are not formed in a particular way, when they're trying to paraphrase what you're telling them, sometimes they'll make a good faith effort. But if you're arguing with someone who is already convinced otherwise, then it's very hard to do so. Like once I remember I was chatting about something with someone who was once a guest on my show. I won't name him, and at the end of it, he said that I'm so surprised to hear you say all these things because all I heard about you is that you're libertarian, and I thought these libertarians are heartless bastards, and now you're saying all these, you know. I'm like, yeah. So at some level, it's a problem of communication, and the point is, I really don't like labels, so I won't even accept that label if you give it to me because labels become tribalistic. Whatever label you take, 95% of the people who ascribe that label to themselves are basically chutias. So it's best to avoid labels and just speak in terms of principles and values, and try to move forward that way.
So on principles and values, which honestly is something that bothers me the most. Again, I'll explain myself and why and where I come from. This is something that I've deeply. Now, somebody might say this is my privilege because I come from a background that is slightly successful, where तुम्हारा बिजनेस क्लिक हो गया तो तुम ऐसी बड़ी बड़ी बातें कर सकते हो. Kind of a thing. Okay, point taken. आप बोलते जाओ. But the point is, still doesn't change the fact that when it comes to morality, I do value morality a lot. I live my life on certain very hardcore principles till the extent that it. Again, I'm not judging people who don't do this because I don't know their circumstances, but it took me to a point where I just decided I'll never do ad reads on my podcast. I just drew the line. I will not do it because if I and for me it was such a sensitive issue is that I wanted to criticize religion. Somebody might say it's such a stupid reason. I was like, listen, you just cannot criticize religion in India if you're associated with any company. And I am a very open critic of it. In fact, I think in the Indian podcasting space, probably other than you and I, nobody does it. I honestly don't know anyone. One of the biggest reasons I respected you the most in that space is because I'm so sensitive. There was my bias. The reason the respect increased was because other than you and I just did not see anyone. Just don't see anyone touching the religious subject, and they don't want to. And for me, these things matter so much that I will not do this, I will not do that. I've never hidden that I have a BJP leaning. It means that BJP people also tend to like me. Natural है भाई, बीजेपी को वोट करने वाला है, सेमी पॉपुलर पॉडकास्टर है, तो बीजेपी वाले बात तो करते होंगे. मगर उसके बाद भी आई कंसिस्टेंटली से नो टू सो मेनी बीजेपी ऑफर्स. लाइक मेरे को अगर कोई आ जाएगा, कोई बोलेगा कि भाई फला बंदे से बात कर लो पॉडकास्ट पे, मैं मना कर देता हूँ. मैं बोलता हूँ क्योंकि मेरे को नहीं करनी. एंड देन इट्स हिलेरियस दैट पीपल फाइंड इट वेरी हार्ड टू बिलीव कि ये मना करता है. मैं एक्चुअल में मना करता हूँ. एंड नाउ दे हैव अंडरस्टूड कि ये पागल है. तो ये पता नहीं क्यों है, क्या है, किसके लिए पैदा हुआ है, मगर ये अपनी चीज करता है. एंड देयर आर now this question, people, when I ask them this question, they think it's so stupid. They are perplexed when I ask them. As simple as, why should we be good? And what is good? It's such a basic question, but why do people find it so surprising? So, Amit, why should we be good and what is good?
So, first I'll answer this. I won't evade it, but first I'll cycle back to what you were saying earlier about not doing ad reads. Where my philosophy is that number one, I will do ad reads because I don't see why not, but it will never be conditional, and I will have to approve of the company. Where my sort of shorthand is, is this something I would use myself? Then I will. So I have said no to a PSB who wanted to sponsor when they said that will you show us your subjects and guests in advance, and I was just like fuck off. And I said no to an Ayurveda company because, like, why would I? That totally goes against everything I say. But otherwise, I'm okay with people coming and doing ads, but I don't look for them. Most of my monetization, as it were, is directly from listeners and so on. So I don't actually go looking for ad sales. Lekin koi aata hai to I don't say no. And the question is, why should we be good? And I'll sort of think aloud and say that I'm not sure that I have a coherent answer for the why. The really nihilistic way of thinking about it is that, of course, we should not be good. We're all going to die. Life is meaningless. Be hedonistic, etc., etc. But the two questions that I have thought about for a long time and try to answer for myself, and what I thought I'll write a book on, because nobody answers these questions the same way, but I did. And the questions are: one, how should I relate to the world around me? How should I behave with other people? How should I relate to the world around me? And the second question is, what should be the relationship between state and society? And these seem like really different questions, but my answer is fundamentally the same, which is consent. That's at the heart of everything. And I'm just using consent rather than freedom. Because freedom can mean so many things to different people. There are positive freedoms, negative freedoms. Rather than get into those kind of murky territories, I think consent is pretty clear. I feel drawn to sort of Kant's categorical imperative as well, that never treat other people as a means to an end, but as an end in themselves. And this is again very hard to do in practice, if not almost impossible to do in practice, because our default mode, I think, for all of us is the main character syndrome, where we are the main character in a play. Everybody else is a prop. Everybody else is instrumental to us. And something that I try to make an effort of is that, as far as friendships are concerned or relationships are concerned, you try to think of the other person as a real person, spend time with them, learn to listen, which luckily doing long podcasts is something that I've picked up, that learn to actually listen to people, get your ego out of situations, learn to understand people. But I find it hard to answer the why question. If I am to answer it at a personal level, I will say that forming a kind of moral or behavioral code for myself gives me a coherent way to live. Then I'm not an animal where I am just responding with my instincts to every situation that comes upon me. Or rather, I've used the rationality that is given to me to construct a framework of behavior, and I follow that framework. And therefore, I'm not wasting that privilege I have of being part of the species, that I can actually construct a framework for myself. And I've thought deeply in the sense of my moral framework. At some level, what happens is that an automatic part of your moral framework is what you get in the cultural norms around you, whether they come from religion or elsewhere or whatever. And uh, and many of them are great. Most of them are great. Like our norms will include treating other people with respect, and etc., etc. Like I often tell people that, in your personal life, no matter you claim to be socialist and you want state interference and everything, but in your personal life you're libertarian. That if four people go out to have dinner together, you are not going to force everybody to eat what you want them to eat. Everybody will choose their own food. You won't make anyone pay for you. You can offer to pay, but you won't make anyone pay for you. Everything is voluntary action. You will respect the boundaries. So in our personal dealings, the norms are all quite reasonable already, but not completely. And therefore, but this is sort of my framework for looking at it. But honestly, I'll have to ask you for your answer to this question: why should we be good? Because I don't have I can give you an answer that applies to me. Why should I be good? Right? But I can't give you an answer that applies normatively to humanity, because, like, who am I to come up with such an answer?
That's fair. So my fundamental axiom: everybody lives their life on an axiom. Most people they are not very comfortable admitting it. I'm very comfortable admitting that we all live by certain axioms. By axioms, I mean, you know how even in math, 1 plus 1 is equal to 2 is based on an axiom. We call it the truth, but the truth is based on an axiom. My fundamental axiom that I live my life on is that it all boils down to the replication of the genome. The replication of this, this thing that we have is our core axiom. And everything is an evolutionarily stable strategy that we are playing since, at least in this form, in the last 300,000 years. Our entire reason for existence is basically stemming from that base axiom. And from that base axiom till this, everything is a game after that. That's how I literally live my life, which is why in my own book, I came to the conclusion, religion, good, bad, but freaking inevitable. That's how I don't know if you remember, I rationalized it through this axiom, because human flourishing. If somebody says that we don't believe in human flourishing, I get scared of that person. Because if you don't believe in human flourishing, then why don't you kill yourself is a natural question that should come to any rational human being. Bill Maher, I don't know if you remember his movie Religulous from 2010-11. There's a beautiful scene in that movie. Bill Maher was being his usual comedic heckling self. He's with a born-again Christian. They're having a wonderful conversation. And he's like, so you believe in Jesus? He's like, yes. So you believe when you're dead, you're going to be with Jesus and God and everything. Oh, yeah. He's like, then why don't you kill yourself? Because it's a better place. You just explained a thing that is far better than this. And then, I saw the expression on that man's eye. He's like, isne to meri laga di. And then immediately the post hoc rationalizing Homo sapien kicked in. But God has a better plan for me. Because that's the only way that person can rationalize that. When I say why be good is that if at the core of our instinct is the replication of the genome, then let's find the best strategy, because human flourishing has to be the core of your value system. If human flourishing is not the core, so whether it is my attack on bigotry of Hindus, bigotry of Muslims, bigotry of Christians, bigotry of anything on planet Earth, my attack on that is purely what leads to the maximum human flourishing at the level of ideas. Why did I become the way I did is because I believed that if you don't believe in human flourishing, and if you don't actually, if your core is not about human flourishing, then what's the point? Because I got over my tribal instincts long time ago. I actually became completely over my tribal instincts, which is why there are people in the so-called BJP adjacent or BJP extended ecosystem. They think I'm a left winger, because the moment somebody says something nasty about all Muslims, you must have noticed I am the first one to stand up. क्या कर रहे हो भाई? सारे मुसलमान तुम सबको मिलके आए हो. किस किस्म की वाहियात बात कर रहे हो तुम? And the moment if I criticize something, and I am an open critic of Islamism, I have never hidden my views. I mean, I go hard at Islamism, and I do believe that if you are a true liberal in India, the biggest assault on liberalism is not, in my view, is not from Hindutva. It is from Islamism, because and I've always said this, Islamism actually broke the back of liberalism globally. The liberal blind spot, and I'm going to say something very controversial. मैं मेरे सारे liberal दोस्तों के साथ, मैं खुद liberal हूँ, हम लोग हमारे liberal talks करते हैं, और मैं उनके मुंह पे बोलता हूँ उनको, मैं तुम टुच्चों को मैं हमेशा ये बोलता आया हूँ, मैं तुम में से एक भी भेंडी बाजार में नहीं रहेगा. मैं उनके मुंह पे बोलता हूँ ये. मैंने बोला तुम लोग सब लोग है ना लोधा के अच्छे गेटेड कम्युनिटी में रहोगे. मतलब तुम में से कोई एक भेंडी बाजार में रहने की हिम्मत नहीं करेगा. मैं तो एक्चुअली मैं स्लम्स में जाके काम किया हूँ, मुसलमान की स्लम हो, हिंदू की स्लम हो, मैं तो हर जगह जाके काम करता हूँ, क्योंकि मेरी कोर सिस्टम क्या है, आई बिलीव इन ह्यूमन फ्लरिशिंग. तो मेरे लिए वो मुसलमान हो कि हिंदू हो कि कोई भी हो, मैं तो किधर भी जाऊंगा. मगर ये जो एक तरीका होता है ना, which is why, see, if people don't know why they should be good, see, at least you attempted it, right? Like, Because see, you think from a very different lens, which is what I understood in our conversation, which is why I enjoyed conversing with you, because you were so honest. Your questioning was always, and I was, when we had the discussion on economics, what was my honest admission to you? Ki Amit, मेरे को नहीं समझ आती economics beyond a point. I don't know if you remember, मैंने तो सबसे पहले एडमिट किया था कि अपने को नहीं समझ आती है भाई, अपना वो वर्ल्ड व्यू नहीं है. मगर if we can't even think of things like why we should be good, Amit, as a society, then isn't that the reason we are so comfortable butchering each other?
So I'll state a minor disagreement, but then I'll go back to that sort of model framework which you laid out. The minor disagreement is that while I agree with you broadly about the dangers of Islamism, it's not reared its head in India. That's my sense of it. That Islam in India has been by and large peaceful and assimilative, and I don't see it as a problem. So I do think
but
the greatest.
Pakistan kyun hua? How do you justify Pakistan? That's the pure product of Islamism. Wait, Pakistan, pura ek desh hi nikal gaya.
That was then, and we can have a long debate about Pakistan, and maybe we should do a live stream some other time. But I think that over the last 70 years, I don't really think that it's been an issue over here. Radical Islam hasn't reared its head here, and we can have a different debate about Kashmir. I've got episodes of The Seen and the Unseen on it. But leave this aside. Just to go back to that point that you were making about the genome and the imperatives of the genome. And at a descriptive level, I agree 100% with you. At a prescriptive level, I don't. Like, I think there's a danger here of committing the naturalistic fallacy or the is-ought fallacy, where you derive an ought from an is, where just because things are a particular way, you then argue that they should be that way. Now, I know you're not doing that. Your argument is a little more nuanced than that. But that is, for example, what people like. My core issue with Jordan Peterson is that he does just that he commits that naturalistic fallacy, and all his oughts come from the is, that this is what men are like, this is how they are wired, this is what has been women's role in society.
I state the complete opposite. I say get over it.
Yeah, exactly. And both you and I want to get over it. So I think that thinking of the propagation of the gene is a guide only insofar as it helps give you a description of how we've become what we are, and the instincts within us, some of which we have to fight, and some of which the better ones, which we should amplify. But I don't think that per se it leads you to have a moral code. To actually come up with a moral code, I feel that you need to go a little beyond. For example, if the propagation, if the imperatives that you get from the way you're hardwired is all that matters, then you would be going out every day and bonking as many people as you could, right? That's what your genes tell you to do. But we don't do that. We don't behave like that, because there is also a rationality on top of that with which we have either constructed or imbibed a moral sense, and we let that be a guide to our behaviors. And you spoke, and I'm still interested in where yours come from. We did speak a lot about it in our episode together, so that's my basic reaction. I completely get that that sense of the way we are wired mattering in the way that we look at the world.
The way the man is wired, they want to bonk Amit. The way whose woman is wired is she wants to save. So that's why we can't, is because the other species cannot.
But the point that they're not another species. But the point is that you take that into account, and then culture comes into place, and then you figure out ways of dealing with.
Men are the same species.
No,
I was being facetious for a reason. Yeah.
Totally. No, I think one dangerous thing to do is to deny that there is hardwiring, and to say that everything is culture, which is of course not the case. We are hardwired often in contradictory ways for things that we can judge both as good and bad, and then the role of culture is that you mitigate the bad aspects and hide them away, and you amplify the good aspects. And I think in modern times, in some ways, the opposite is happening.
The battle at its core, in my view, is gene-culture co-evolution. It's a co-evolutionary process. It's not just the gene, and it's not just the culture, where a lot of my friends which I loosely now call the Indian relativist wing. Because, by the way, in India, the left is not relativistic. The left and the so called right wing both are morally relativistic. Both of them are. Because you will not give pathetic arguments justifying the butchering of a particular community the way the Indian left and non left does. You have to be a moral relativist to give those justifications. That's why I say in India, actually, there are only two wings: the moral relativists and the moral objectivists. The moral objectivists are people who dislike the BJP, like the BJP. It's just people with a moral center and people who are not with a moral center. Now, I have come to this conclusion where people who have a very flexible moral center and their moral center is driven by many reasons, I don't know what, or in India, the larger divides are what I call the Saste Stalins and the Mini Maos. And then there are people like us, people who believe in the idea of freedom. And I want to spend some time on that because I know that is something both you and I, and probably I say it with a lot of seriousness, that maybe you and I are a dying species in that sense in India. Because it really worries me. And this is not कि बीजेपी के अंडर ये ज्यादा हो रहा है या कांग्रेस के अंडर ये कम था. No, I truly believe that is the baseline of the Indian Union. The Indian state is built on a fundamentally authoritarian mindset. This is the fundamental foundation of the Indian state from Nehru to Modi. And it scares the shit out of me. But I am very paranoid about it. Are you as paranoid as maybe I am when it comes to the creeping authoritarianism of the Indian state?
Bro, you're not even close. I'm much more paranoid. Let me kind of explain where I come from. Well, firstly, let me say that it's really interesting that when you said that you don't think of the Indian polity as having left or right, but moral relativists and moral absolutists. And similarly, I mean, I haven't thought much about those lines, so I won't go there. But I would also say that there's no left or right. The way that I think about it is, those who believe in state coercion and those who don't, and then what happens along that continuum. Now, I have often said that to me there are three problems with India today. One is a proximate problem, and the other two are much deeper problems. Now, the proximate problem is not going to last forever. It is something you and I will disagree on. For me, that's a party in charge. I don't like this current dispensation of that party. You may feel otherwise, but that's okay. We can have a reasonable disagreement on it, and I don't think it's a core disagreement. The other two, I think, we'll both be in agreement on. One is our fractured society, which has pretty much always been this way. And like today, when I look at our politics, I say politics has caught up with society. This is what our society always was like. And the second is our authoritarian state. And part of it is circumstantial. I don't even know whether we can blame individuals for this. If you look at the circumstances of the founding of the union, like there's an interesting book by Subhashish Bhadra called The Caged Tiger. I have an episode with him, and he makes a really interesting point there. He says if you look at constitutions around the world, you will see that they all arose in a particular time as a result of certain circumstances, and then you're stuck with it. So the American Constitution is so great with such an emphasis on A, individual freedom, and B, federalism, because of the circumstances of its founding. Similarly, look at the circumstances of India's founding. Basically, when the drafters of the Constitution are meeting in Delhi, the country as we know it, as these lines on a map, doesn't exist at that moment in time. That is a 2-3 year project with Sardar Patel and VP Menon are engaged upon, and I have a great episode about VP Menon with Narayani Basu of The Seen and the Unseen as well. And it's a fascinating project, and when you look deep into that project, you think in one sense one feels a little bit of a disquiet, because what the British did over 300-400 years, these guys are trying to do in a few months, and they succeed. It's like a project of fast track colonialism. where you are bringing together all these princely states and etc., using either coercion or promises that are later broken. But forget the disquiet. I love the country as it is today, and I totally believe in these lines in the map as they are today. Let's take that for granted. But what's happening when the constitution is being written in Delhi? What's happening is that across the country there are riots, the country is falling apart. The West is skeptical that, hey, can you be a democracy? No country in this stage of development has ever been a democracy. And it seems like the center won't hold. So the natural impulse at that moment is to centralize power as much as possible in the union. Gyan Prakash has a book on the emergency where he argues that nothing that Indira Gandhi did during the emergency was actually unconstitutional. It was all there in the constitution, and the reason so much power was centralized by the constitution is because the country was falling apart, and also because our new leaders took over the British template of building a constitution that would protect the state from the people and not the people from the state. A good liberal constitution should have safeguards for the people. It should protect the people from the state. Our constitution actually has it the other way around. Free speech is not adequately protected, and so on and so forth. And the point is, once you have that historical moment where you have a constitution written in stone, which pays lip service to federalism, but actually there's no federalism. And again, if you think about this, the reasons for this are sound, right? Should you have localized government from the bottom up, or should you do it in a top down way? And Ambedkar's argument against the bottom up thing is, look at our villages. As he memorably said, I forget the exact quote, but it's about our villages being a sink of localism and a den of ignorance, and so on and so forth. You're never going to get rid of caste in his eyes, and I think he was right about this, if you just leave it to the villages. So his distrust of bottom up governance is entirely justified. His thinking, or at least entirely understandable, that you get where he is coming from. So you have these impulses towards centralizing power, that let us keep the country together and let us make sure that we are driven by our higher principles because we are enlightened people, rather than let the sort of the fault lines of society express themselves in bottom up governance. So that's the instinct towards centralization. And again, I'm being completely descriptive. It's an explanation, not an exculpation. It's just so that we understand why it kind of came about. And once you have that centralized design, how the fuck do you break past it? You're kind of stuck with it. You have instantly, like, a question people often ask is, oh, we had such great leaders in our freedom movement. Where are those great leaders now? And I had written a column once for Bloomberg Quint where I argued that the incentives changed. The incentives changed because all the great leaders we had of the freedom movement, whether it is Patel or Rajaji or Nehru or Gandhi or whoever, they had no lucre to aim for. Power wasn't a proximate thing for them. So everything that they did for higher principles. And that is why they were the kind of people they were, and that is why some of them made the mistake of assuming that it doesn't matter what system we design, everybody will be like us only. But the point is, once you have that centralized design where all power flows through the state, as we know, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely, the incentives change, and that therefore the kind of people who want to become politicians and rise in politics, that changes. So you get a different kind of leader entirely, and the system gets more and more centralized. The system gets more and more oppressive, and there is no party that is immune to this. I feel that at least in economic terms, we had a golden period between 91 and 2011, and I've had many episodes about this, about the inside story of both economic policy and the politics of the time, where many of the politics leaders on both sides of the aisle were working with each other, and I admire that greatly. But we have lost that. So we had that 20-year period, I think, between 91 and 2011, when it felt that there was some hope, but that's dissipated again. And I think it's actually become worse in the sense that there is a deep polarization, in the sense that the parties don't speak to each other anymore. The leaders don't speak to each other anymore. Everything that the BJP does will be opposed by the opposition for the sake of opposition, and vice versa. And let me kind of tell you two really interesting stories which illustrate how this was different during the period I pointed out. I have a great episode on pensions with Ajay Shah and Renuka Sane, and Ajay was one of the people who designed the new pension scheme, and he did this working with the Vajpayee government and a lot of interaction between his team and Vajpayee's team, and he refers to Vajpayee and Jaswant Singh and Yashwant Sinha as just absolutely outstanding statesmen. So they realized that the Indian state is kind of going to go bankrupt. You'll have to listen to the episode to see why, and therefore we need something to take its place. They convinced Vajpayee. Vajpayee put all his political capital behind it and they designed it. But then the elections came in 2004. And Vajpayee had the grace to say that the elections have come, let us leave it for the next government. So they leave it for the next government. And then Manmohan and Chidambaram, again, two figures I'd admire a lot, unlike current leaders of the Congress. Manmohan and Chidambaram then come and they get the economic logic of the thing. Their thinking is not that this is something the Vajpayee government wanted to do, so now it's in the dustbin. They see the economic logic of the thing and they support it and they let it happen. That's anecdote one. Anecdote two actually happens after the 2011 point, but it happens in 2014 where I have a forthcoming episode with Ajay where we discuss this in detail as well. I had an 8-hour episode with KP Krishnan, an insight player in all of this, which is like almost a masterclass on the working of the Indian state during these years. So since 2002, a group of people, including Ajay and Krishnan and others, are arguing for inflation targeting and why it is so essential. And then finally, circa 2013, Chidambaram takes it up and he agrees with them. They make the case, they design a document, and that final document is designed by Chidambaram and Manmohan loves it, and etc. etc. But again, the elections are coming in 2014 and they have the statesmanship and the grace to say we shall not push this through. We are effectively a lame duck government. If I become finance minister again, I will do it. Otherwise, I should leave it for the next person. So the next person comes, Jaitley, takes over, and then Krishnan presents a document to Jaitley and he presents it on a particular evening. The next morning, Jaitley says, let's do it. So Krishnan says, whoa, hold on a bit. I want to do this. I think it's great for the country, but it is a sweeping change. It changes the institution of the RBI entirely. Don't you want to read it? So Jaitley says, firstly, I have read it. And secondly, when the finest legal mind and the finest economic mind of this country say that this should be done, who am I to disagree? And he meant Manmohan and Chidambaram. So that is the kind of politics that you had. Ki bahar aap kuch bhi bolo, but there is a mutual respect. You realize that you're all working towards the same aim of making India a better country. And circa 2015, that kind of for various reasons that I've discussed in my podcast, but this is perhaps not the space to get into, that dissipates entirely and it falls apart. And in a sense, I think of these guys as outliers. And this is an argument I've had with Krishnan and Ajay and others, that I think you guys were outliers. You did the right thing, but the incentives weren't really for that. When you have a state that is so powerful, the incentives will always be towards consolidating power and using it to increase your own wealth and etc. etc. And so that's a bind that we are in. So these two deep problems, whether I might be against the BJP, you might be for them. Both of us know that they won't be there forever. Politics is always in turbulence, it changes. That's a proximate problem, it's not such a big deal. What do you do about the oppressive Indian state? What do you do about a fractured society? Those are deeper problems that I don't have an answer to.
My worry is that this creeping authoritarianism that exists in the Indian state does not get a pushback is because there is a creeping authoritarianism in the Indian society. I don't know whether you agree with me or not. I think that the reason the state, see, politicians are like a television. वो चैनल बन जाता है जो मुझे देखना है और कुछ नहीं है. पॉलिटिशियन एक टेलीविजन है. मुझे अगर सास बहू ड्रामा देखना है वो सास बहू ड्रामा बनेगा. मुझे गोविंदा की कॉमेडी देखनी है मुझे वो गोविंदा की कॉमेडी बन जाएगा. किसी को पॉर्न देखनी है वो पॉर्न बन जाएगा. बेसिकली पॉलिटिशियन इज व्हाट यू वांट देम टू बी. Politician is actually the greatest folk psychologist I've ever come across in my life. Politicians go with the people. They understand the pulse of the people. They don't get it right a lot of times. But what is the fundamental value of a successful politician? I see a lot of condescension when people come and say, they always say that about their opposition. The moment Arvind Kejriwal wins back-to-back elections, whiny BJP voters will be like, अरे ये तो ऐसा ही है. मतलब भाई उसने समझ लिया दिल्ली वालों को स्टेट लेवल पे क्या चाहिए. नहीं ये तो वोटर्स को कुछ अक्ल ही नहीं होती ना. उसको समझ पड़ गया अक्ल है कि नहीं है, वो इज नॉट द क्वेश्चन. उसको समझ पड़ गया करना क्या है. तुमको मोदी कितना भी पसंद नहीं हो, मोदी को एक्चुअली समझ पड़ गया एक सर्टेन क्लास ऑफ वोटर को इंडिया में क्या चाहिए और वो उनको वो दे रहा है. सिमिलरली नेहरू को समझ पड़ गया था कि एक सर्टेन क्लास ऑफ वोटर को उस टाइम पे क्या चाहिए, उस वो दे रहा था. पॉलिटिशियन बेसिकली एक साइकोलॉजिस्ट होता है. दे जस्ट गो अराउंड एंड द फर्स्ट पास द वोट सिस्टम incentivizes and disincentivizes certain things, but it is what it is, and no system, a lot of times people will be like proportionate representation hona chahiye. I was like, I don't know how good or bad proportionate representation as a system is, and that is not the aim of our chat either today, but that's how politicians work. The reason Indian politicians are not pushed enough on many occasions to do a lot of things in our society is I think the Indian system is very relativistic. For example, Barkha and I were having this conversation, and Barkha very openly said that it's appalling that a country like India does not have a uniform civil code. It's actually appalling. It's morally repugnant that India actually has civil Sharia. I forget civil Sharia, right? When our common friend Nikhil Mehra, एक बार मैं और निखिल है ना फोन पे बात कर रहे थे, तो मैं निखिल, वी हैव दीज लेट नाइट कॉन्वर्सेशंस. निखिल भाई हमारे मूड में आते हैं 11 बजे के बाद. तो निखिल मेरे को बोलता है, तू यार शरिया की बात करता है, तूने कभी क्रिश्चियन लोगों के डिवोर्स लॉस पढ़े? मैंने बोला ना, भेज. तो उसने मेरे को भेज दिए सारे डिटेल्स, और मेरा तो दिमाग काम करना बंद हो गया. मैंने बोला यार ये देश है कि क्या है? हम लोग हाउ कैन एज अ मॉरल पर्सन हाउ कैन यू एक्सेप्ट एनीथिंग लाइक मैं और फिर मेरे पीछे बोलते हैं, आई मेक इट अ पॉइंट, आई नो लॉन्गर से एनाइलेशन ऑफ कास्ट, I say annihilation of jati varna. I don't know if you have noticed this. I have taken this to the next level of Ambedkar and Savarkar because both of them hated the system with a passion. मैं तो अभी बोलता हूँ ये जाति वर्ण को ही खत्म करना पड़ेगा, क्योंकि ये इतना घटिया सिस्टम है और हमारे पॉलिटिशियंस इतने कंफर्टेबल हैं. To me, freedom matters a lot. To me, how can you be morally justifying a blasphemy law in India because your religious sentiments are hurt? How do you and I, as responsible content creators, because I consider you to be one of the more responsible content creators of India, I have a very low opinion of most content creators in India. And I know you don't agree with me on that either, but it's okay. I mean, I'm very open about my lack of admiration of most content creators in India because they really don't care. But how do we talk about freedom, Amit? How do we push young kids to demand more freedom?
So you've, in this masterful question, you've actually come back full circle at the end to what you started with. And I completely agree that politicians are supply responding to demand. So when I talk about the political marketplace, like one argument I often have with friends of mine who are in the think tank space or the public policy space, and they'll be meeting bureaucrats and politicians and trying to make a difference, is that you are at the wrong end of the political marketplace. You are at the supply end. You should be at the demand end. अगर आप demand end बदलोगे, if there is a public clamor for something, then the supply will automatically change with that. So that is where the real battle is. And unfortunately, my considered answer, even a lament to what you asked at the end, is that you and I are not going to make a difference. Like at one level, people often say that, all the elites of tomorrow listen to your show and the elites shape policy and the elites shape the world. So you're getting the job done. A lot of the elites of today as well, in fact, listen to the show. But my point is that I think that's scratching the surface. I'm not optimistic. Like, एक तो अगर आप अंग्रेजी में करोगे तो there's a natural sort of limit to that. If you really care about your ideas, it becomes your responsibility almost to take them into the languages, to try to get more and more people listen to them. And I've been thinking about this a lot, that how do we do that? That it is not enough to do the things that we do. There has to be a way of going beyond. So I do the things I do because I feel like it is my dharma to do at least this, if I can use that word in a non-religious sense, because of course I am as much of an atheist as you can imagine. But I do feel that in my value system, this is, it is my dharma to do at least what I am doing. But I recognize that it only goes so far. That agar aapko really demand end of the political marketplace badalna hai, so you won't have to see these ideas on TikTok, or TikTok is of course banned in India, but you got to see it on Insta Reels and YouTube Shorts, and you got to see it achieve mass popularity. which is not the case. So, but you still have to fight the battle, and I think of it as a long game. Like, one way I think of it is that maybe if there's a 15-year-old girl out there somewhere in some small Indian town who's heard my episodes and who listens to the show, and she is Prime Minister of India in 2050, who knows? So, that's the kind of long game that you play. You want to put all the ideas out there, and you want them to have an impact. But uh, my ongoing sort of thinking process about this is that, listen, अंग्रेजी में कर लिया, ideas are out there. Abhi, you got to get it into the languages, especially the kind of things that I care about and the kind of frameworks that I use to look at the world, and they're simply not there in the languages. So it's, at some level, it's a problem waiting to be solved. And so I'm not super confident that you and I are going to move the needle in any kind of short or medium term way. Long run may, if you make the discourse better in subtle ways and future creators get influenced by you, and and the content, like, I've always aimed at my content, I've always thought of my content as being timeless. Like, when a friend of mine asked me advice for starting a podcast, I said, don't think of just going across geography ki har jagah log sunenge, but also think about going across time, that in 2050 people will listen to this content and they will understand the times and the currents and etc etc. A lot of my episodes with people are like oral histories. It's the shaping of a life. Like, I think at 2050, if someone listens to my episode with you where you were so eloquent and so honest and you put yourself out there, that they'll get a sense of who you are at this point in time and all the issues that you're grappling with, and that has a value of its own, and it's worth doing for its own sake. But, like, what do you feel? Can the needle be moved? What are your thoughts on this? Because you've also been doing this for a long time.
I'm actually very positive that we can get things done. The first thing is, what I have realized is most people don't stand up for free speech of the people they dislike the most ideologically. That is the fundamental flaw. So here's what I have started doing. This is something, consciously, or I don't know, unconsciously, subconsciously, whatever is the word for it, some of us have started doing. In fact, I applaud my dear friend Abhijit Iyer Mitra for one thing. He is one of the few people who have consistently. Does he agree with Umar Khalid on anything? No, he will never. Yeah, he will be nasty to Umar Khalid, but every time somebody asks him about Umar Khalid, he's like, "Usko bail do." When Arvind Kejriwal was sent to jail, Abhijit का सीधा first principal answer था, Arvind Kejriwal को bail होनी चाहिए. Bail should be the norm, not the exception. And the authoritarian Indian state, or whether it is what the horrific incidents in Bengal and oh my God, the culture of authoritarianism in Bengal, and this is cutting across party lines. This is just the culture of political violence in Bengal. And we just cannot have a conversation about these things. All the culture of political violence in or Bihar, or as an ethnic Punjabi, we should be talking. मैं तुझे बाद में बताऊंगा वो बंदे का नाम, because he doesn't. I reached out to him on the DM, no BJP lover, and I was like, यार तू पंजाबी मैं पंजाबी, यार पंजाब को हो क्या रहा है? It's like that state is rotting. Why don't Punjabis care? ऐसे कि यार वो स्टेट के फंडामेंटल मॉडल खत्म हो चुके हैं, और उनका मॉडल ये है असी कनेडा जाना है, और उन्हें की करना है, कनेडा जाना है, बेवकूफ जाए, मतलब, और ये बातें कौन करेगा? और एंड व्हाट आई हैव रियलाइज्ड इज द मोमेंट आई टॉक अबाउट इट, somebody, because मानो या ना मानो, I actually disagree with you on this. The one good thing working for both you and I, in a very funny way, is the elites listen to us. वो तुझे भी सुनते हैं, मुझे भी सुनते हैं. ये तुझे भी मालूम है, मुझे भी मालूम है. ये मतलब, और ये मैं सिर्फ ओपन बोल रहा हूँ. ये हम लोग ओपन में ये बात रख रहे हैं. Elites हमको सुनते हैं. Elites have disproportionate power in shaping the society. The moment elites तुमको सुनते हैं, and still you don't talk about these issues, then you are immoral. So actually वो जो it's a funny that वो French philosopher की line थी, I know Spider-Man ने उसको famous कर दिया कि वो great power comes great responsibility. But if you are someone in the podcasting space or in any kind of content, whether you are writing articles, and if you don't talk about it, like, for the biggest problem that has happened in our discourse is that if there is a Ganpati procession going, I always tell my lefty friends, if there is a Ganpati procession going and there is stone pelting on it from the mosque, तुम लोगों को सबसे पहले खड़ा होना चाहिए उसके लिए, तुम लोग खड़े हो उसके लिए. और द कंप्लीट ऑपोजिट सिनेरियो ऑफ दैट इज किसी मुसलमान बच्चे को उठा के ऑन द सस्पेशन ऑफ बीफ उठा के धो दिया, मुझे खड़ा होना चाहिए. अगर हमने ये बेसलाइन नॉर्मल कर दी ना, तो हमारा समाज सुधर जाएगा. और ये एक्सपेक्टेशंस लार्जर मासेस से नहीं, हमसे होनी चाहिए. हम हैं जो ये करते हैं. देयर आर वेरी फ्यू पीपल हु आर गेटिंग नियर टू व्हाट लाइक, and some of us who are financially blessed. I'm not saying we are Mukesh Ambani. No, we are not. But देखो, हमारे खाने पीने के लाले नहीं है. हमारे खाने पीने के लाले नहीं है. हम एक कंफर्टेबल लाइफ जी सकते हैं. और अगर हम जैसे लोग जो असल में ईमानदारी से काम करते हैं, we truly work at it through the sheer will of our principles. And if we are not going to, यार क्या हो रहा है? मतलब कोलकाता पुलिस is going on blocking Twitter and अबे पुलिस ही मुझे ब्लॉक कर रही है, तो मैं किसके पास जाऊंगा? It's like, what is happening in this country? And you have politicians blocking people willy-nilly. Like I had a discussion with Barkha on this. I said, Barkha, how can a member of, I don't care until and unless it's a direct threat. I don't care if somebody called a woman politician nasty things. Like Barkha ne bola, what if they call her a slut or something? I was like, Barkha, politician na bano fir. Am I endorsing calling someone a slut? No. बस एक बरखा पॉलिटिशियन आजकल ब्लॉक कर रहे हैं. हो रहा क्या इस देश में? डू वी अंडरस्टैंड अ एमपी कैन नॉट ब्लॉक अ सिटीजन? व्हाई आर वी नॉट गेटिंग दी? हम लोग ये चीजें ही नहीं कर रहे हैं. एंड टू बरखा's credit, she immediately understood what I was saying. She's like, मैंने बोला बरखा वो औरत नहीं है, वो एमपी है. हायरार्की चेंज हो गई है पावर की. एक औरत जो एमपी है is way more powerful than a man anywhere in the country, even if they don't have. I was like, when are we going to understand these things? So this is where I am coming from. So I am actually like, I am trying to push Indian content creators towards this. I was like, you have to be more, because आज अगर यार ये लोग कर क्या रहे हैं, किसी को भी उठा के जेल में डाल देते हैं. और होता क्या है अमित, जिसको बीजेपी पसंद नहीं है ना, वो चुन के, बिकॉज भाई 12 स्टेट में बीजेपी की हाइपोथेटिकली गवर्नमेंट है, 12 स्टेट में बथेरे तुमको एनेक्डोट्स मिलेंगे, देखो बीजेपी जेल में डाल रही है. ओ भाई, मगर हर स्टेट में ये हो रहा है इंडिया में. मैं इसके लिए तो मैं बोला, हर शाख पे सस्ता स्टालिन और मिनी माओ है, हर स्टेट में सस्ता स्टालिन, हर म्युनिसिपैलिटी में है. तो क्या करें? दिस इज व्हाट स्केयर्स मी. एंड आई एक्चुअली बिलीव it is a moral responsibility of a Amit Varma, of a Kushal Mehra and many others around. And I don't know why. क्या मैं ही गधा हूं क्या? मुझे ही दिखता रहता है ये. मुझे तो कई बार लगता है कि मेरे ही दिमाग में कुछ लोचा है, पता नहीं क्या, मैं ही पागल हूं साला, मैं ही इसके बारे में रोता रहता हूं. और फिर मैं रोऊंगा, रात को निखिल मेहरा को फोन करूंगा, बोलूंगा यार क्या हो रहा है हमारे देश में, ये क्यों कर रहे हैं हम लोग. लाइक टू मी दिस इज द क्राइसिस ऑफ द आवर.
I'd sum up my approach towards the world and what I do in this beautiful phrase I picked up from somewhere: pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. So even if I think the world is going to hell, I will still keep acting and doing the things that I do, and I think you'd kind of agree with me. And on the mention of Nikhil Mehra, I think actually he is much more fun than both of us, so he should have been in the conversation as well. Awesome guy, I haven't met him for ages, but yeah, I mean, I broadly don't disagree with that fundamental premise that we have to keep doing what we are doing. Sometimes I just feel disheartened ki faida kya hai yaar, like even like for example, these days I use Twitter and social media only for broadcasting my links, right? So on the scene and the unseen and everything is everything, I'll be completely bindaas, jo bolna hai bol dunga, nothing is taboo, nothing is beyond bounds, I'm putting myself out there. But I simply don't do that on social media because it is so pointless. There's such the discourse is so shallow, it's a culture of outrage, etc., that I have just stopped taking part in that. So the discourse itself is very messed up, and so you do what you can per se, and you have to keep doing it. So I agree with you there.
Because I feel so passionately about these things is why I do this podcast. I have no financial incentive to run this damn thing anymore. I truly don't. For me, if I don't talk about these issues, and I don't care who listens to it, the idea, like, I want to talk about this concept with you. This is something that worries me again deeply. I have used very strong words for it, but the civilized word for it is click farming. I want to talk about it because, see, at the end of the day, both you and I are content creators. Do you think, and this is, I'm not talking about Indian content creators per se, because now I have an experience and insight into the Canadian content landscape also, right? Because I'm an Indo-Canadian content creator. And मेरा दिमाग एक्चुअली पूरी तरह से खुल गया है, क्योंकि मैं अभी आधा साल यहाँ रहता हूँ, आधा साल भारत में रहता हूँ. So I have been exposed to what social media is doing to our brains on a live basis, and there is a human universal. ये सबके साथ हो रहा है, Amit. How much of click farming is morally justifiable? Is my next question to you.
I'm not sure if it's a moral question. I would not do it. I know you don't do it, I presume. But I do, people figure out the moral codes that they live by. I think, see, one important thing to remember is Sturgeon's law, which is 95% of everything is crap, right? So that is always going to be the case, whether it is with books or music or podcast or whatever. Also, what is going to happen in every age without fail is that people are going to try and cater to the lowest common denominator, and they're going to do what it takes, and your click farming will come from there, and simplistic takes on everything will come from there, because complexity doesn't get you views, nuance doesn't get you views, etc., etc., and you will sort of have that race to the bottom. I have like two ways of thinking about it. One way, the broader way, is that all of these people will get a lot of views but shallow engagement, that there is no deep engagement with their content or with their ideas. You're clicking and swiping, you see something entertaining, thoda sa maza aaya, and you move on. Whereas I would say that, like, my content definitely gets far deeper engagement. I'm sure yours does as well. And that's that deeper engagement means something. Like, I remember back in the day, about the seen and the unseen, I used to say that, and remember, it's an audio podcast, and I used to say that I'd rather have like 100,000 downloads of an episode than 10 million people watch me on YouTube, because those 10 million are going to be very shallow engagement. The average view time of some channels might even be 15 seconds, 20 seconds. It's kind of meaningless. But I have an average session time of 40 minutes, and which is off the charts. I was an internet professional in the aughties. If you told me back then, I would have said it is only possible in the sort of the most high engagement video game. Otherwise, 40 minutes to ho hi nahi sakta hai. And it's not just like, this is not a humble brag. I think it's true of podcasts in general, audio podcasts in general, that the more immersive ones will get that level of engagement. Like I love the work Lex Fridman does, for example. I'm sure he's got that level of engagement as well, if not better, right? So I think you also have to see the quality of viewing and not just the quantity of views. That's one way to think about it. The other way to think about it as a creator is, what do I want to do? Like, my writing students, or in the past podcasting students, would often ask me, what is a hole in the market? Where can we go? And I would say, no, do not think like that. The only thing that makes you unique out of the 7 billion people in this planet is you. So rather than try to second guess what people want to see, just focus on being yourself and amplifying that, and that'll make you, that'll make your content authentic to yourself, and then people will come. And it's a process that takes time. But if you just try to second guess what viewers want, you will lose yourself completely, even if you manage to find success with clickbait. And that's simply not worth doing. So these are my ways of thinking about it, that if any of my writing students, like, it's not that we disagree on the quality of the content out there or the content creators out there. My sense is that I simply won't think about them, and there's no point in being judgmental. Like, अगर कोई बंदा मेरे पास आके बोलेगा that फलाना ढिमकाना का podcast इतना बकवास है and इतने views मिलते हैं, my only answer is कि यार, don't shit on them. If you feel that's not good, then go out and make something better. There's no point. Like, somebody at a party once asked this question, and you tell me your answer to it, but the question was that, complete the sentence, there are two kinds of people in the world. So I said, there are two kinds of people in the world, the doers and the whiners. right? And actually it is a binary, and actually one leads to a virtuous cycle, one leads to a vicious circle. Now if you look at Twitter, it's full of whiners. There are always people shitting on other people, screenshot laga ke snarky comment dal diya, etc., etc., and that's all they're doing. And the whiners get together with other whiners, and they never do anything. They just whine all the time and get more and more bitter, and it's a vicious circle. And then there are doers who are ignoring that shit, who are just putting work out there, and because they're putting work out there, they're also interacting with other doers, and that becomes a virtuous cycle where you and I can inspire each other in different ways, give each other ideas, and continue producing work. So I think it's really important to uh, you know have that approach ki the content universe is like deeply unsatisfying and objectionable and fucked up, लेकिन हम अपना काम करेंगे, and they are doing things for understandable reasons. Like if there's a 22-year-old kid who wants to do a podcast where he talks to people, and if he's making a good faith effort, it is okay to criticize him and say that he's showing no discretion, he's calling any random tantra guy to his show, he's never pushing back when they talk nonsense. But वो बच्चा क्या करेगा? वो बच्चा जो कर सकता है करेगा. He's figured out something that works. There's no point shitting on him. He'll also grow up one day. That's a natural tendency. 95% of everything is crap. You do the best work you can and focus on that. And that's kind of my philosophy कि मुझे काम करना है यार. If I want to see what's wrong with the world and feel good by passing judgment on them, then there's no end of things. And all day only I'll be passing judgment. But मुझे काम करना है.
Fair enough. I understand where you're coming from. काम तो सबको करना होता है. But the point is that but then at the same time, if we care for the health of the society, why my fundamental problem with, again, because I'm so hardwired to think on these issues from moral imperatives, is that like I was giving, I'll share that example openly जो मैं तुझे offline बता रहा था. So just today morning in when I got up here in Canada, I saw this, there's this tribe, tradition in Himachal where वो ऐसी नाम का वो शस्त्र पूजा करते हैं, ऐसी अपनी तलवारें ऐसे ऐसे करते हैं and डांस करते हैं और रख देते हैं. And lo and behold, एक साइड ऑफ द पॉलिटिकल आयल उसको बोलता है हिंदुत्व टेरर, और एक साइड ऑफ द पॉलिटिकल आयल उसको बोलता है देखा हमने मुसलमानों की बजा दी. दोनों साइड एंगेजमेंट फार्मिंग कर रहे हैं, दोनों साइड कर रहे हैं, दोनों साइड कोई मॉरल इंपेरेटिव से आ नहीं रहे हैं. उधर कोई मोरालिटी है ही नहीं इस पूरे मार्केट प्लेस जिसको हम बोलते हैं. I am not as disciplined as you, but I have reduced myself in many ways also. But because I am more of a, the nature of my podcast is all over the place. So sometimes, I'm doing a lot of current affairs also. So I end up commenting a lot more on average than you do, because you have actually gone into that long form, jisko bolte hain absolute long form range. In my case, I'm still, if there is a current issue where I believe there, so I have small rules, like I will not react till 72 hours because I know इतना टाइम तो लगता ही है सब कचरे को बाहर आने को, and by the time that entire information comes, even in the RG car horrifying case, as much it was, but the 150 ml or whatever semen allegation ended up, the police investigation showed that was not the case, and luckily person like me did not follow the click farming rule, and I waited and I found out कि नहीं ये तो नहीं था, बाकी सब बहुत सच था. So I could nuance my argument better. But today what bothers me is that I think click farming is a direct result of the failure of the economic model in many ways. Something that you are very passionate about, that you have not been able to convince people to get into much more jobs that actually the marketplace needs. And in a very funny way, right now, if you look at most economic reports, I may not understand economics, but I try to read as many reports as possible. There is, I just did this podcast with Karan Bhasin where we spoke about unemployment statistics, and that Bloomberg video of 10 minutes, to my utter shock, that भारत बिना बात के ग्रेजुएट्स बनाई जा रहा है अभी. सबसे ज्यादा अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट अंडर द एज ऑफ 25 हमारे ग्रेजुएट्स में है. एंड सडनली द भल्ला भसीन एंड वर्मानी पेपर शोज दैट बाय द टाइम दीज किड्स रीच 29, उन फॉर मल्टीट्यूड ऑफ रीजंस, कुड बी कि मैं यूपीएससी बनना चाहता हूँ, मैं ये बनना चाहता हूँ, मैं वो बनना, जो भी रीजंस होंगे, और द मार्केट रैशनलाइजेशन इन इंडिया इज जस्ट नॉट गुड इनफ, एंड इवेंचुअली दे ऑल गिव अप, एंड बाय द एज ऑफ 29 almost everyone ends up having a job in India, जो जॉब मार्केट में जाना चाहता है, and unemployment statistics drop. But lo and behold, अगर आप बिल्कुल पढ़े लिखे नहीं हो तो इंडिया में आपको फटाक से जॉब मिल जाती है, क्योंकि आप में वो जिसको बोलते हैं ना, दिस जॉब इज बिलो मी वाला वो फिल्टर ही नहीं है. तो आप जो जॉब करते हो, और आज की डेट में ट्रेड्समैन आर इन अ रियल नीड फॉर द मार्केट. नाउ how do we deal with all these issues in a society like ours, where content creation has now become a easy and it is very dangerous. Like इसका तो मैं नाम लूंगा क्योंकि मुझे कुछ फर्क नहीं पड़ता. एक पता नहीं, कोई तो ट्विटर पे हैंडल है इयन माइल्स कोई चोंग, अपेरेंटली वो भाई रहता किधर, मलेशिया में है, और वो ऐसी वीडियोस डालता है बैठ के अमेरिकन पॉलिटिक्स में. ही इज लाइक ही इज मिल्किंग द मेगा क्राउड. जैसे मतलब उसको वो गाय मिल गई है, वो रोज उससे 5,000 लीटर दूध निकाल रहा है. मगर पॉइंट ये है कि लोग बोलेंगे ठीक है ना, उसका काम है करने दे, मैं थोड़ी ना बोल रहा हूँ उसको बैन करो. मगर why should I not have a moral judgment on all of this that is happening is something that I grapple with.
So, my short and sweet answer to that is that sure, have a moral judgment. I think it's just how do we categorize our judgments? You might say moral judgment, I might say a moral judgment. I just think they suck. It doesn't really matter. I share the lament. The question is, what do you do about it? And there are two different ways you can react to that question of what you can do about it. One is you can say ki regulation honi chahiye, and I am completely against any kind of state power being used on anyone, because you and I are the first people who will be shut down when that happens. I think it is a beautiful feature of the internet and the the marketplace that you and I can do whatever the hell we want. मुझे 8 घंटे की podcast करनी है, मैं करूँगा. आपको चारवाका podcast ऐसे करना है exactly as you want it on YouTube. We have that freedom to do so do all of these other people. I think the only way to change the discourse is to become a part of it and to feed it and to try and make it better with our own work. And that's what I try to do in the long run. But ultimately the point is, the truth is that human nature is messed up. A lot of the things that happen just plays on that. A lot of the content will play on the tribalism, will play on the sensationalism, will feed the bad news bias, etc., etc. That's just human nature. And but like I said, I don't worry too much about it, because it is the low engagement of sheep, and ultimately you try to do good content and you try to make a difference by making different content, and I don't see any other solution for it. Any restriction on freedom would rebound on us very badly, and we should not think along those lines.
So how do you conceptualize, like, I want to cover something, like how does your mind work? That was something that I wanted to understand.
So now I have these two different sort of shows. The Seen and the Unseen is still the audio podcast long form. Once upon a time it used to be subjects, but the idea was deep dive. So when I did my episode on 370 with Srinath Raghavan, it wasn't immediately after 370 was repealed, but 3-4 weeks, and I wanted to give the definitive historical overview of what actually happened back in the past and give that context. And Srinath is amazing. I think we succeeded at that. But that was then. Now a lot of my episodes are sort of more oral history territory, and they get into people's lives. And for that, my main barometer is this an interesting person? Like, I've always defined the show as a journey through my own curiosities, and then whoever comes along. And right now it's all about, is this an interesting person? Can I have a good long conversation with him? Am I genuinely curious about this person? Do I have a baseline level of respect for the work they do? There are people on the extreme right and left I'll never have on the show, but otherwise it doesn't really matter. I've I had a lot of people I disagree with vehemently on the show, and that's fine. And so it's really following my personal interest. As far as my YouTube show is concerned, it's called Everything is Everything. That's with a co-host called Ajay Shah. We've reached around 65 episodes right now, and there it is the idea of the name of the show, we took it from a Bruce Springsteen song. Both of us love this song called You're Missing, which has this great line, everything is everything, everything is everything, but you're missing. It's a song after 9/11. But um, apart from the fact that the song means a lot to both of us, I also love that framing of everything is everything, because it indicates that the world is all interconnected. What has happened in many fields, and especially in academics, is people get trapped into silos. Ki economist sirf economics sochega, or wo bhi the silos get narrower and narrower till somebody's final paper will be on wheat production in Peru between the years 1635 and 1637, and it's just nonsensical. And I think what we need to do is broaden out and apply frames from multiple disciplines to the world, and therefore the title everything is everything. So the idea is that we are both people who have multiple frames and interest in various subjects, and we'll just pick something and we'll look at the world through different frames and kind of make it interesting. So we've had a bunch of episodes on subjects that we are deeply passionate about, but we've also had a bunch of episodes on subjects where we are in a sense almost thinking aloud, applying different frameworks to something and thinking aloud, and not coming to a final judgment or anything, but just using those frames to tease out possibilities. So we do that also. So they're both intellectually stimulating in different ways. And my whole thing is that I don't want to do anything because I feel there's a demand for it. I want to do something if I feel that it's intellectually stimulating, or mere mein kuch personal growth ho rahi hai, I'm learning something, then it's a good reason to do something. And I want to expand my own knowledge. Every episode will force me to read multiple books, for example, and I always learn from that process. So that's kind of what drives me. What drives you?
I think beyond a point, I feel that my platform should be the one place where I have a moral responsibility towards certain things. I'll give you an example. So right now we have this giant debate on immigration in Canada. A lot of Indian kids are coming over here from Punjab, especially from Punjab. Honestly, they should not be here. They're not qualified to be in this country. They can't even speak basic English. It's a disaster. And in that, there are horrific stories that are happening. So in Brampton, it's a city in and around Toronto. There is a Lotus Funeral Home where every month the person who runs the place tells media 4 to 6 or 4 to 8 Indian international students are committing suicide due to multiple reasons. There are cases of sexual exploitation of young Indian girls who are coming to study over here. Now, when I hear stories like this, as someone who now has a platform, I just don't know why I should not talk about it. So I'll give you an example. I'm saying this not as a matter of pride. I'm saying this with a lot of pain. That I saw this video on a channel called Kahani, और उसमें ना इंटरव्यूज दिखाए थे कैसे हमारी पंजाब से और बेसिकली पंजाब की बच्चियां हैं, उनको लाया जाता है इधर, पासपोर्ट उनका कॉन्फिस्केट कर लेते हैं, और फिर एक आदमी उनके साथ जाता है, वेगस लेके जा रहा है उनको, उनसे स्ट्रिपिंग कराया जा रहा है और वापस लाया जा रहा है, और ये सब यहाँ पे तमाशे हो रहे हैं. मुझे किसी एक मेरी पाकिस्तानी दोस्त ने मुझे भेजा वो यहाँ पे. उसने बोला भाई कोई बात नहीं करेगा कंटेंट क्रिएशन लैंडस्केप में, सिर्फ तू बात करेगा, ये मुझे मालूम है, और कोई बात नहीं करेगा. और पहली बात है कि किसी की इतनी गुडविल भी नहीं है कि वो बात करे और उसको लोग सुनेंगे. तो दैट्स व्हाई शी रीच्ड आउट टू मी. यार मुझे तो बहुत बुरा लगा. मुझे लगा मैं अपने आप को शाबाशी दूं कि अपने आप को जूता मार लूं कि मैं किस समाज में रह रहा हूं कि सिर्फ मैं बात करूंगा. ये कैसे हो सकता है? ये क्यों हो रहा है? अगर आपके पास एक आवाज है जिसमें आपको साल में कुछ मिलियन लोग सुनते हैं सब प्लेटफॉर्म्स मिला के, और आप बच्चियों को ट्रैफिक हो रहा है उसके बारे में बात नहीं करते, बच्चे सुसाइड कर, मैं नहीं बोल रहा हूँ कि आप सिर्फ उसके बारे में बात करो, मैं तो मस्ती मजाक की भी बात करता हूँ, मैं तो स्पोर्ट की भी बात करता हूँ. मैं यार महीने में एक बार तो कर ले, एक बार करने में क्या जाता है? मुझे ऐसा लगता है द रीजन टुडे आई एम अ कंटेंट क्रिएटर इज दैट I want to be that person. मेरे को कुछ फर्क नहीं पड़ता है. And you know the irony is, वो वीडियो ऑफ कहानी, उसके कमेंट सेक्शन में जाओगे, सारे कमेंट है वी आर हियर फ्रॉम चारवाक पॉडकास्ट, वी आर हियर फ्रॉम चारवाक पॉडकास्ट. मुझे खुशी नहीं हो रही है वो देख के, मुझे रोना आ रहा है वो देख के. मैंने बोला सालों सिर्फ मेरे यहाँ से आए हो, तो बाकी क्या कर रहे हैं? मगर हम क्यों कर रहे हैं? इट इज सो सैड कि हमारे कोई भी बच्ची हो, लाइक I'll give you two instances. ये why I am the way I am. Because see, I've never hidden. I am a activist also. My podcast is also an activism. मैंने कभी नहीं ये छुपाया. मैं बड़ा honest हूँ इसमें. पहले साल जब मैं आया था 2022 में, see, I had not come to Canada for 8 years. From 2014 to 2022, I had not stepped foot, like मैंने इधर पैर भी नहीं रखा था. तो मेरी जब फर्स्ट टॉक हुई थी ना, टोरंटो पब्लिक लाइब्रेरी या किधर थी मुझे याद नहीं है, 2 छोटी बच्चियां आई, और मुझे कोई शर्म नहीं आती है, वो हिंदू बच्चे थी बोलने में, क्योंकि ये बहुत जेन्युइन प्रॉब्लम. वो 2 हिंदू बच्चियां आई मेरे पास, अपने पापा को के सामने थोड़ा झिझक रही बात की, नहीं, एक 10 साल की हो गई, एक 8 साल की हो गई. उन्होंने बोला अंकल वी वांट टू टॉक टू यू. आई वाज सेंसिंग कि वो अपने पिताजी के आगे बात नहीं करना चाहती थी. बोला ठीक है बेटा, I will sit down with you. And then I sat down with them and they said, uncle, we're really not interested in going to school anymore. I'm like, huh? I said, yeah, Indian bacha not going to school. I asked regular questions. Is your father forcing you on the grades? And you know how our culture is very toxic, grade obsessed culture. She's like, no, it's not mom and dad. We go to school, they mock our Hinduness. They mock us for believing in idolatry. They mock us for this. That broke my heart. That day मैंने कसम खाई कि अब मैं लड़ूंगा इस चीज के लिए. Last year, my wife's best friend, my wife grew up in a very small town. Like it's I think she was the only brown girl in the entire school when she was in high school. Her best friend is a gori. Like it is very normal here. सबके गोरे दोस्त ही होते हैं. मेरी वाइफ जैसे लोगों के जो यहाँ पे पले बड़े हैं. We were having dinner on, we go out all the time, and मैंने ऐसे ही जनरल ऑब्जर्वेशन में बोला यार मुझे बहुत इंडियन दिखते हैं आजकल इधर. मैंने बोला उसकी 9-10 साल की बेटी है, वो उठती है, शी गोज टू द मदर, और वो कुछ उसके कान में खुसूर पुसूर करती है. माँ उसको देखती है, बोलती है यू कैन से दिस. उसको क्या बोलना था मालूम है अमित? यस आई एग्री. उस दिन मैंने कसम खाई कि ये 2 चीजों के पीछे मैं पूरा लग जाने वाला हूं, कि इतनी वोकनेस हो गई है यहाँ पे कि एक गोरा बच्चा एक मेरे जैसे रंग के आदमी के साथ अगर खाना खा रहा है, वो गोरा बच्चा ये तक नहीं बोल सकता है हाँ मुझे तेरे जैसे लोग बहुत दिख रहे हैं, क्योंकि इट विल बी परसीव्ड टू बी रेसिस्ट. लानत है ऐसे सिस्टम पे, लानत है ऐसी सोच पे जिसने बच्चे को गुलाम बना दिया. Who cares what the color of the skin of a child is? White, black, brown, Hindu, Muslim, वो बच्चा है यार, बच्चा है. जैसे कई बार लोग बोलते हैं ना फलस्तीन और इजराइल में, I've never hidden my views on Palestine and Israel, but I feel for every single Palestinian child. I am never going to hide that fact. जब कोई बात नहीं कर रहा था, मैंने शादी हमीद को बुलाया था, जबकि ये कोई कॉन्फ्लिक्ट ही नहीं था अक्टूबर 7 के पहले, और मैंने द पैलेस्टीनियन पर्सपेक्टिव करके पॉडकास्ट की थी. आई रीच आउट टू शादी एट दैट टाइम. तभी ऐसा कोई ये नहीं था. आई वांटेड द पैलेस्टीनियन पर्सपेक्टिव ऑन माय पॉडकास्ट. Whether I agree or not is immaterial. That is what drives me. I feel I've reached a stage in my life where I have become financially secure. I believe by pure luck. I may not be the biggest platform in India, which I know I'm not. I have no delusions of grandeur, but I have a platform in India now. I do. And through that platform, now the only thing that drives me is, do I raise issues or not? So that is why when I see bigotry against Muslims being generalized in a certain section, I talk about it. When I see bigotry against a Hindu child in Canada, just because they are a Hindu, I talk about it. When I see a system oppressing a white child just for being white, I talk about it. This is what drives me now. That I don't know if you understood where I'm coming from.
No, I get where you're coming from. I think I'm sort of a little older than you, so some of that fire within me has kind of become more mellow, as it were, with age. But I totally get it. I mean, you have to keep doing what you do, and like you correctly said, that what is the point of speaking if you cannot speak what you want to speak about? So if these are, whatever matters to you, obviously you're going to talk about that. And I think any external considerations that one brings to bear, ki log kya kahenge, or is there a market for this, and etc., are just completely pointless. You have to be yourself and speak about the things that you authentically care about. Otherwise, what is even the point?
Yeah, and to me, religion has always been a centrifugal realm of my life, and I think people fail to recognize what religion does to people, what role it plays in people's lives, and but I still, before somebody accuses me ki, I actually did want to give you the platform to bash the BJP. No, I believe me, and it's not like you want to it. I want you to do that, and I want you to, because I think it's the right thing to do. I think on a platform like mine, where the probabilities and the distribution of more pro BJP folks coming and listening has to be there, that I need a voice as credible as you to come and make the case against the BJP. And I want people to understand that if you love democracy, the BJP cannot be an end in itself. It has to be a means to an end. People have made the Congress and BJP or the Trinamool or the Samajwadi or whatever party they like, they have made the political party an end in itself. That is the problem. The discourse is so, वो जो tribalism की आप बात कर रहे थे ना, वो creep कब होता है? जब BJP becomes bigger than democracy. Congress and Rahul Gandhi are bigger than democracy. Like, I mean, imagine that journalist Sharma, who was manhandled by Rahul Gandhi's crew. Nobody is batting an eyelid. Nobody cares. अरे उसको धोया. अरे उन्होंने उसका फोन निकाला, फोन में से उसके वीडियोस डिलीट किए, उसका iCloud का कंटेंट डिलीट कर दिया. कोई आवाज नहीं उठा रहा है. So I want you to make the case against BJP.
So, I used to edit this policy magazine called Pragati, and we had the editorial policy that I framed for them is that we will never speak about parties or people, will only speak about ideas and policies. Now, the thing is, I've said a lot of anti-BJP things on various...
And I know, and for the
yeah.
record, ladies and gentlemen, Amit has a lot of things that he likes the BJP for, but I still want him to make the case against them.
No. So the case I'll make is simply this: that look, I'm actually equally against the Congress, frankly, but it's a BJP in
I
power,
know.
and therefore they are more dangerous, and therefore, like, I have always spoken against a party in power, not simply to speak against a party in power, but unfortunately, we have lived in times where the party in power has always gone the wrong way. So, number one, here's something I'd like to say, that uh, every party in India has been essentially left wing on economics and right wing in terms of society, and therefore anti freedom in both ways. It's the worst of both worlds. The difference between the BJP and its current avatar is that it is also explicitly anti Muslim in some ways, and I have an issue with that. Arun Shori once, again, another man I admire greatly, once said that NDA is equal to UPA plus cow. And the cow part of it is a problem. But of course, the NDA is equal to UPA is also a problem, because the consensus in terms of policy across parties goes pretty much in the same direction, which is against freedom. My case against the BJP will really be a case for India and a case for my values. That, a lot of people in 2014, not me, but others, for understandable reasons, thought that supported the BJP because they were completely fed up of what had happened in the past, and they thought that okay, we need winds of change that are stronger than what we have right now. And across various margins, I could understand those sentiments there. That yeah, you want a freer economy, and this is not just a numbers game. My friend Nitin Pai once calculated that every 1% rise in GDP lifts 2 million people out of poverty. So it's a moral imperative to have growth. Only growth gets you there. And that is one reason people bought the rhetoric of the Modi campaign, that growth would be important, the government has no business being in business, minimum government, maximum governance, etc. The rhetoric was great. I understand that. The point is that the government didn't live up to that, and that people who believed in those values needed to change their mind once they saw that the government hadn't lived up to that at all. No one who believes in markets or economic freedom and so on could look at what happened during demonetization or the botched implementation of GST, which hurt so many small businesses, or looked at the various kinds of restrictions across the country, or the tax terrorism that goes on these days, or the government's habit of sending the ED and the CBI after all its enemies. No one can look at that and pretend that they conform to the values that they claimed to believe in. So I had this sort of disillusioning moment where I realized that many people, many people, once they realize that the BJP isn't going to live up to those values, in fact, they're going in exactly the opposite direction, they change their minds on the BJP, which is what thinking people do. But a far greater number of people than that stuck to supporting the BJP because by that time it had become tribal. And you've seen the same thing happen in the US with the Republican Party. That if you think about what Trump stands for, he does not stand for anything that republicanism used to stand for in the good old days. Like a Reagan Republican would be appalled by Trump. Trump's economic policies, his anti-trade policies, for example, his vision of America as an isolationist economy, it was almost identical to Bernie Sanders, right? There's nothing in the Republican worldview that it takes from, and yet the entire party essentially, with a few honorable exceptions, threw its weight behind him and behind the whole MAGA agenda. So the broader disillusionment I have is that people I thought cared about principles didn't care about the principles. They picked a tribe and they chose a tribe. So what I would say to everyone who is supporting the BJP is that think of the reasons for doing so. Like the question I ask for anyone who's against the BJP is that have they done anything good? And the question I ask anyone who's for the BJP is have they done anything bad? And if you don't have an answer to either of these, you're thinking along purely tribal terms, because the world is complicated, and a lot of policy that comes out of a government has nothing to do with the party. There is. And I have so many episodes on this. I don't know whether we should call it deep state, as that's a pejorative term, but there is a policy pipeline where things take decades to boil up, and etc. etc. And just because a party does something in particular doesn't mean it is by default bad if you hate the party. Parties you don't like can do good things, parties you like can do bad things. And if you recognize that, then that's fine. But if you think that everything the BJP has ever done is great, then I need to seriously question that. So I don't want to make a question against the BJP in particular. Like a lot of the economic thinking of the Congress and all the noises they made before these elections were utterly appalling. They have completely left the wisdom of the Manmohan Singh and Chidambaram era apart and almost gone back to an Indira 70s kind of thinking, totally simplistic. Just utterly appalling in different ways. So, it is not as if that party would necessarily be much better, except that they wouldn't be anti-Muslim, which is super important for me and which is a differentiator on which I will base my judgments in the current day. But what I would say is think about the values. And if you agree with me that we should have a freer economy and a freer society, then think about what the party in power is doing about those values and decide accordingly. And it is perfectly reasonable to say that I will support policies at particular points in time. मैं इसको support करूंगा, उसको नहीं करूंगा, rather than just in a blanket way say this party good, that party bad. Like a lot of the opposition to the BJP, I think, has, it's okay to oppose them for all the things I described, the demon, which was such a catastrophe, the botched implementation of GST, or the anti-Muslimness in general, etc., etc. But there have also been good policies coming out of there. I remember when Adityanath cut the labor laws. Now, it is my nightmare of Adityanath ever running this country. I cannot oppose any individual more than I oppose him. But the point is, doing away with the labor laws, as he proposed to do a couple of years back, was entirely overdue. Everybody who knew the subject agreed that those labor laws harmed poor people more than helped them. They stopped medium-sized companies growing bigger, achieving scale. They were a key reason that we missed that labor-intensive manufacture that could have been our ticket to prosperity, and instead was China's ticket to prosperity once upon a time, and is today Bangladesh and Vietnam's ticket to prosperity, while we are still stuck behind, right? And every right-thinking person should have said, "Ki, theek hai, we don't like this guy, but ye kaam theek kar raha hai." But instead, just because it is someone you oppose, you reflexively oppose those. Even with the farm laws, I had a great episode of this on the Seen and the Unseen with Ajay Shah, and what both of us sort of agreed on was that the politics was terrible. It should have happened through a consultative process where you speak to all stakeholders, do it slowly, do it over a period of time. But the economics was great, right? And the freaking Congress knows this, right? Every economic policy person for the last 20, 30 years knows this, agrees on this. I'm sure Manmohan and Chidambaram would also know this deep inside. But because it is the BJP, you have to sort of oppose for the sake of opposing, oppose everything that they do. And for me, that's a problem. So what I would say to everyone is that, okay, whether you support the BJP or you support the Congress or whatever, don't do it because they are your party, they are your tribe. It's like you're supporting Manchester United, though why anyone would do that, I don't know today. But don't do it because it is your tribe and you've chosen them. But think about the values you hold dear, think about the direction you think the country should go in, and then objectively evaluate ki ye kaam sahi hai, ye kaam sahi hai, ye kaam sahi hai, and then you look at that, and then you add your voice according to those values. I think there is a danger in just thinking in a blindly tribal fashion. So that's sort of my kind of summary on it. I'm sorry if you wanted a stronger case against the
No, no,
BJP
no,
per
no, no.
se. I'm unable to provide anything stronger than this, and I really don't like the opposition as well. And yeah, and there was a time the BJP was a better party. I think the Vajpayee administration was excellent. Like, again, people contain multitudes. Whatever you think of Vajpayee the politician, Vajpayee the prime minister was bloody good. It got important reforms through, governed in a consultative manner, consulted even the opposition. It was, had some excellent people in that cabinet. And I don't care where it comes from, what party it comes from, what political changes make it happen, but I'd really love to see a return to the kind of politics where the politicians have the humility to speak to experts, where politicians have the openness and grace to speak to the opposition and sup together, and do things that are genuinely good for the country, rather than base everything on a political calculus, which itself I think every party kind of gets wrong.
Do you think there is a future for political individualism in India at all?
Define that. What do you mean by that?
Where policies are based on the sure, pure metrics of human flourishing, and where the individual is the focus, not the group. For example, I'll give you examples of that. Indian policy making is always group obsessed, not individual obsessed in many ways. Whether it's Rahul Gandhi demanding a caste census, it's a group lens, it's not an individual lens. Whether it's the BJP creating laws like love jihad laws, it's the group lens, not the individual lens. When Samajwadi Party or anything, the opposition to the Uniform Civil Code is when you flip the individual lens and look at the group lens. Because let's get very clear, there is nothing Hindu about the Hindu Code Bill. I don't know how else to say. As a humble student of religion, I can assure you the Hindu Code Bill is the entire opposite of what Hinduism would do to a woman. So I don't know how to call it a Hindu Code Bill, because the Hindu Code Bill is a secular code bill. Actually, today the Hindu Code Bill is the only secular code bill we have in this country. And we have these multiple ways of looking at it. And what scares me the most about India is that in India, the individual is lost in the political realm because everybody is pandering to groups, whether anything like, Congress says they will do things for the LGBT community. BJP says they will do this, and then their leader will come and say the nastiest things about Muslims in general. Are they a top rung leader? No. But the point is not that. This should not be normalized, saying nasty things. The Congress will come and say the nastiest things about, like, DMK comes and says we have to eradicate Sanatan Dharma. It is a parasite or something of that sort. I mean, these are not good things to be said, but because we have a group lens in our politics. So can we flip it to the individual lens? That, in that sense, is what I'm saying.
So I'll give you a three-part answer, and I'm just thinking aloud. First is that, like you correctly pointed out earlier, that politicians are supply responding to demand, right? And if you really want to make a difference in the way, in the change of that lens, you'll have to change it within society first. It won't happen from the top down. You'll have to change it within society. You'll have to get, we'll have to get these ideas out there in the marketplace of ideas and fight for them the best that we can. That's part one. Part two slightly contradicts that, in the sense that there are times where elites can make a difference. Like episode 28 or 29 of Everything is Everything is an episode called The Reformers, where I said that there's a great story that has happened over 40 years in India and there should be a web series on it. And I laid out the story. And the story starts with Manmohan in the 60s, and then Montek in the late 70s, and then goes all the way to about 2015. And it's about a group of people behind the scenes, including bureaucrats, policy people, economists, and some politicians across both parties, who actually implemented policies that put the individual at the center and are good for individual rights and not for group rights. Most of these in the economic domain, but even otherwise. And this wasn't out of a demand that came from society, but it was from within the state, and it involved both economists and policy wonks and bureaucrats and politicians, and they're all heroes of mine. So that's an episode I really sort of enjoyed doing. So it is possible to swim against the tide. I have spoken with I have a long episode with Montek Singh Ahluwalia. I have episodes with KP Krishnan, who was part of that. Ajay, of course, is my co-host and was in the finance ministry from Vajpayee's time to Modi's time. So I have spoken, and all the way in between, did a lot of work with Chidambaram, etc. And I have this, my argument with all these people is that you guys were outliers, and their argument is that no, the good people who really want to do things for the country can make a difference. So this is a counterpoint to the earlier point I made. The earlier point I made being that you have to change the demand end of the political marketplace, but there are arguments people would make ki bhai, we had 20 really good years, 91 to 2011, and part of that is this community of insiders who made that difference, and they were responding not just to the typical incentives that consolidate power, etc., but they also had values and beliefs, and politicians will also want to leave a legacy for future generations, and etc. So that way change is possible. And my third point is that maybe it doesn't matter. Like, if there is one thing that gives me hope, it is that in different ways technology empowers individuals more than political liberalism ever did, and in different ways. You and I are being able to have this conversation today. We have the podcast that we do, the shows that we do, because technology empowered us and gave us a voice. And once we had the voice, it took a lot of iteration to become good at our craft. It took a lot of talking and thinking to become better thinkers. So all of that comes from technology despite the state. And my hope is that more and more, hopefully, in the lives of individuals, the state can recede, and we can be empowered in different ways by technology, by markets, by urbanization, etc. So that is also a hope that I have, though, given the nature of the oppressive state, and the sort of shit that sometimes happens, I sometimes don't feel as optimistic as I otherwise would. So these are sort of my responses.
So one last question before I let you go. What next for Amit Varma? और यार कोई अच्छा रेस्टोरेंट बता यार, अभी आ रहा हूँ बॉम्बे वापस थोड़े दिनों में.
हाँ, तो तू आजा, कहीं जाएंगे. I mean, my perennial favorite in Bombay is O Pedro. I'm sure you go there often. Do you?
बहुत अच्छा है, उसका खाना बहुत अच्छा है यार, बहुत अच्छा.
Yeah. O Pedro is really good. Recently, I ate at Veronica. The same guys. I mean, Samir and Yash have been on my show as well. The owners of these.
अरे यार, तेरे को एक जगह मैंने लेके जाना है. Have you been to माला अकबरी?
No यार, where is this?
अरे तूने मेरे साथ चलना है, और फिर you will love that person, और तू उसको पॉडकास्ट पे बुलाने वाला. मैं तुझे एडवांस में बोल रहा हूँ, क्योंकि you know what he has done? He has studied the history of Indian cuisine and different stages. Indus Valley, अलग 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 अलग. भास्कर मेनन is the owner. भाई उधर जाएंगे अपन खाना
डन
खाने.
डन डन. कहाँ पे कब?
और मैं तेरे को बताता हूँ. इट्स इन द वेस्टर्न सबर्ब्स आई थिंक. मैं गया था दिल्ली में. सो यू नो हाउ द स्टोरी इज दैट अभिजीत इज फ्रेंड्स विद भास्कर. अभिजीत इज एन एब्सोल्यूट फूडी. तो अभिजीत मेरे को उधर ले गया. बोलता है यू विल लव इट. ही इज अ नर्ड. ही लव्स द रेस्टोरेंट बिजनेस. एंड आई वाज लाइक यार ये तो क्या कमाल है. क्या खाना है और क्या जगह. एंड द वे भास्कर एक्सप्लेन. भास्कर पॉडकास्ट कर रही है. And then Bhaskar came, and then Bhaskar has now opened up in Mumbai. So I was like, not only do I have to promote it, I will make sure all my friends promote this. It's just, I love the passion with which Bhaskar comes.
Passion is a whole game. If you do something for love, it can't be bad. So yes, we will go.
Yes, udhar jayenge. And tell me now, what next for you? Then what is Amit Varma now looking at?
I'm looking at writing. Like ever since I was a kid, I thought of myself as only one thing, which was a writer of fiction. And regrettably, I haven't done enough of that. I wrote one shitty book in 2008, but regrettably not enough. And I want to redeem myself and write a lot more. It's been really frustrating for me that I have gotten caught up in these currents of life. Podcast hai, show hai, just not had the time. And when I have had the time, I have simply not had the discipline. So I blame no one but myself. But I haven't had the discipline to write the stuff that I want to write. So now in this phase of my life, I want to kind of get more writing done of a very different sort than what people expect from me. But you know, you follow your heart, you follow your love. I'm extremely fortunate that every day I wake up in the morning and I can look forward to the day. I do things that I love doing. I love the seen and the unseen, and everything is everything. They're labors of love. Thankfully, shit has worked out in such a way that I can also make money of them, and the writing course I teach, and so on and so forth. So I don't have financial worries. I do what I love. All of that is great. But I feel some of my deepest desires are desires I haven't been able to indulge in adequately. So that's something that I'm going to do in the next phase of my life. Yeah.
Awesome, man. I have to say before we wrap up, I have said this to you many times on WhatsApp, but I really respect you for what you're doing, and I hope that there are more people like you in our trade, especially in our trade, where and in these times where, to me, what breaks my heart is that so many times I get these messages from left leaning folks. They're like, अरे यार तेरी पॉडकास्ट सुनते हैं मगर शेयर नहीं करते हैं. मैंने कहा यार क्यों. बोलते नहीं यार कैंसिल हो जाएंगे. आई एम लाइक यार बड़ा. एंड and when my book came out, I had reached out to you and you said, "Are good you reached out to me. I anyways wanted to reach out to you." And then we had the conversation, and you have nothing, been always been kind to me, and I was like, uh, you know, if anything, Amit and I can break the mold of people who may disagree but can still, have deep respect. And I say this, I have deep respect for what you do, and I wanted to put this on record. So once again, thank you for whatever you do, and thanks for coming and chatting with me.
No, thank you so much. And I will also put on record that one, the admiration is mutual. I love the way that you think. I love that when I have conversations with you, I feel my brain is expanding a little bit. You make me think about stuff that I wouldn't otherwise have thought about. So thank you for that. I love the work that you do. And I recognize that it is a labor of love. And in that sense, I think, I feel that you're a kindred traveler. I think it was a great honor for me when you agreed to come on my show. It is equally a great honor for me that you have invited me onto yours. So thank you for this, and long may the conversations continue.
Great. So guys, in the description of this podcast, I'm going to, obviously, Amit's X handle will be there. I will leave Amit's website. I think that's the best place to find everything Amit does, whether it's his podcasting, whether it's his YouTube links, whether it's his writing course links. I think because that's how I figured out everything Amit does when I went on his website. So if you truly believe in good things, one last anecdote I'll leave. So when my book launch happened in Toronto, I had called Chandra Aryaji. He's a member of parliament in Canada. And Chandraji, while he was driving all the way from Ottawa, first of all, I have to appreciate Chandraji. He drove all the way 5 hours plus just to come for my book launch, and he drove all the way back on the same day. And while coming to my book launch, he was basically listening to Amit Varma and Amit Varma's conversation with Kushal Mehra to understand Kushal Mehra. And he's in his talk in Toronto, he mentioned that, I listened to Amit Varma regularly, and then I found out that, oh, Kushal has also come on Amit Varma. And if you don't listen to Amit, then you're not challenging your priors. The first thing I've always said, that if you, which is why I did not want to paint Amit as an anti-BJP person, because Amit is not an anti-BJP person. Amit comes from an idea that the state sucks. Amit has that libertarian name. So every time Amit comes, that's how I have understood Amit. Amit is just like the state sucks. Why I can relate to Amit a lot is because in many ways I am like that. The state sucks. And if you don't follow Amit, then you're missing out on something. So to everybody who's going to listen to this, whether you listen to this on the audio version, or you're watching this on YouTube or on Facebook or on the Twitter live stream, anywhere, you have to follow him. Agree or disagree does not matter. Challenging your priors is what matters. So I will leave you guys at that. As far as I'm concerned, you know the drill. You can support the Cārvāka podcast through the membership program or anything of that sort. I'll see you guys next time. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.